The Iran-Contra scandal transfixed Washington for most of 1987 and renewed a struggle as old as the Republic between the President and Congress.
I will tell you right now, Counsel, and all the members here gathered, that I misled the Congress.
How can our system of government work if the administration is not candid in its answers to the Congress?
Congressman Lee Hamilton of Indiana and Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North of the President's National Security Council defined the two poles of the argument: a Reagan administration obsessed with preventing leaks and a Congress that could not get a straight answer to its questions. The Reagan administration's determination to sell arms secretly to Iran and to help guerrillas fighting the Marxist government of Nicaragua despite congressional objections was the engine that drove the Iran-Contra policy. Secretly, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North devised a scheme to finance the Contras by overcharging Iran for the weapons and to use the profits to help the rebels in Nicaragua.
I don't think it was wrong. I think it was a neat idea.
Navy Vice Admiral John Poindexter, the President's National Security Advisor, kept details of the diversion from President Reagan and the President's advisors.
The buck stops here with me. I made the decision.
The President's top foreign policy advisor, Secretary of State George Shultz, testified he was never aware of the diversion and he was angry.
Sometimes I feel like I'd like to wring somebody's neck.
Congress was astonished and deeply troubled to find that a major foreign policy initiative was being carried out by private businessmen and run by the National Security Council staff.
It seems to me what happened in all of this is, in effect, there was a junta within the government of the United States. A coup, in effect, had occurred in the White House.
A democracy demands not only that the rights of the minority be protected, but that the rules of the majority be respected. And that's true even if you and I believe that the majority is wrong. We have to respect the rule of law until we can change the law itself, because otherwise the rule of law will be reduced to the law of rule.
The committee's final report went further. It said the ultimate responsibility for the events in the Iran-Contra affair must rest with the President. If the President did not know what his national security advisors were doing, he should have. In years to come, historians may say the Iran-Contra affair was only a minor incident in Ronald Reagan's presidency. But in the short term, it has severely damaged his credibility and his ability to get his programs through Congress.
As Washington enters the new year, it is reeling from earlier revelations in a Beirut newspaper that profits from arms shipments to Iran in 1985, intended to buy the hostages' release in Beirut, were used to fund the Contra War. First, Reagan steadfastly denies the charges.
The United States has not made concessions to those who hold our people captive in Lebanon, and we will not. The United States has not swapped boatloads of plane loads of American weapons for the return of American hostages, and we will not.
But as time goes on, his position wavers. Finally, Reagan withdraws from commenting publicly about the investigation.
I've told you there will be no answers on questions of having to do with that until the Tower Commission has submitted its report next week.
In March of 1987, the commission, headed by Texas Senator John Tower, publishes its report, which immediately becomes a bestseller at the bookstores.
That the shipments by...
Then, beginning in April, the Senate Investigating Committee holds public hearings in order to get at the details of the operation. And these hearings make Robert McFarlane, Richard Secord, Oliver North, Fawn Hall, and John Poindexter household names.
What is involved is that in the course of the arms transfers, certain monies were taken and made available to the forces in Central America, which are opposing the Sandinista government there.
I was not the only one who was enthusiastic about this idea, and Director Casey, he referred to it as the ultimate covert operation.
Have you broken the law? No.
By giving Iran what it wanted, military arms, the U.S. was hoping to get what it wanted, the return of American hostages in Beirut. Arms priced by the government at $12.5 million were sold to Iran at a marked-up price. The $12.5 million was deposited in the government account, and the profits were deposited in a Swiss bank account controlled by Richard Secord. These funds were then diverted to the Contras in Central America.
I don't think it was wrong. I think it was a neat idea.
I did not know at that time that there was any money involved. I only knew that we had received our $12 million for the weapons which we had agreed to sell. Then, a little later, when the Attorney General told me that he had come upon something that indicated that there was something to do with money in Swiss bank accounts.
The controversy centers on legal and ethical questions. Ethical because the U.S. government seems to contradict its policy of not negotiating for the release of hostages. Legal because Congress had outlawed covert funding by the government for the Contra War in Central America under the Boland Amendment.
We did not have the view that we were circumventing the Boland Amendment. We simply read the Boland Amendment and believed that it did not apply because we were private.
Then, in May, the hearings go live on national TV, and millions of Americans get caught up in the drama. The investigating panel fires many questions at the parade of witnesses.
$4.6 million you had to keep in this
My position is as I stated it, not as you stated. So stop trying to change my story and move my story around. The facts are the facts.
And so in the Nuremberg trials, we said that the fact that the defendant...
May I please register an objection? I find this offensive. I find you're engaging in a personal attack on Colonel North, and you're far removed from the issues in this case. To make reference to the Nuremberg trials, I find personally, professionally distasteful, and I can no longer sit here and listen to this.
My question to you was, would that have made a difference? You're the person who surfaced it.
Don't get angry, counsel. I'm going to answer your question.
The passion to establish democracy in Central America is brought before the people.
Many of us got involved because we cared about those Nicaraguans willingly fighting, bleeding, and dying in the jungle so that someday they might be able to enjoy some of the freedoms we Americans take for granted every day.
I think it is shameful for the United States to be going around rattling a tin cup. I think it is shameful. I did it because the Contras were, as far as I knew, starving.
Under whose authority was the mission carried out? Did the president know?
You know, the buck stops here with me. I made the decision. I felt that I had the authority to do it. I thought it was a good idea. I was convinced that the president would, in the end, think it was a good idea.
I asked Admiral Poindexter directly, does the president know? He told me he did not.
I made a very deliberate decision not to ask the president so that I could insulate him from the decision and provide some future deniability for the president if it ever leaked out.
But it's the testimony of Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North that captures America's attention for 3 days. Many view him as the ultimate patriot. Others view him as an arrogant lawbreaker. For a short time, he is propelled to the status of cult hero.
I came here to tell you the truth, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'm here to tell it all, pleasant and unpleasant. And I'm here to accept responsibility for that which I did. I will not accept responsibility for that which I did not do.
And these operations were carried out in secret?
Well, we hope so.
They were covert operations?
Yes, they were.
And covert operations are designed to be secrets from our enemies?
That is correct.
But these operations were designed to be secrets from the American people?
Much of North's testimony centers on an altered memo that was traced back to him and his shredding of other documents that may have implicated President Reagan.
I shredded. I was never told not to shred. I shredded because I thought it was the right thing to do.
Fawn Hall, North's secretary, admits to altering some documents and concealing others from investigators.
Sometimes, like I've said before, I believed in Colonel North, and there was a very solid and very valid reason that he must have been doing this. And sometimes you have to go above the written law.
CIA Director William Casey never appears before the committee, having died in May. North and Poindexter are both convicted of criminal charges related to the Iran-Contra investigation. And the president's long-awaited statement on his involvement comes in this address to the nation.
But I respect you too much to make excuses. The fact of the matter is that there's nothing I can say that will make the situation right. I was stubborn in my pursuit of a policy that went astray.
There's a great line in the movie Boys in the Hood where Larry Fishburne is saying, hey man, we don't grow it, we don't own any airplanes, we don't have any laboratories. How does it get here? Why does it get here? And that's a very good common sense approach that intuitively the people in South Central understood, that there was something much bigger than them that was moving the whole drug issue and the drug war.
My parents were staunch Republicans. Back in the 80s, the big concern was not terrorism, it was communism. The Iran-Contra affair was one of the biggest political scandals in U.S. history. Members of the Reagan Administration, headed by Oliver North, engaged in the sale of arms to Iran. The proceeds from these illegal deals were being used to fund the Contras, a right-wing guerrilla group that Reagan referred to as his freedom fighters. The Contras were fighting the Soviet-backed Sandinistas for the domination of Nicaragua.
The Iran-Contra is very important in history. We have to remember the fact that Iran-Contra, its mandate was to investigate the sales of missiles to Iran.
Former DEA agent Celerino Castillo not only fought in the international effort of the American drug war, he also had the rare opportunity of carrying a camera and recording some of the regrettable actions of the DEA and CIA while they supported President Reagan and Oliver North's Contra movement.
George Bush Sr. came to Guatemala on January 13, 1986, and he approached me and asked me what I did there at the U.S. Embassy, what my job description was, and I told him I was a DEA agent working international narcotics investigations, and I told him, look, you know, we have gathered intelligence that the Contras are involved in drug trafficking down in El Salvador. And then he just smiled, shook my hand, and walked away from me. And it was then and there that I knew that my government knew that these atrocities were occurring.
They were so concerned about giving the guns to Iran and all that stuff. The question should have been asked about all that cocaine flying back over here.
In 1986, on American TV, we were all being fed a steady diet of,
we're taking down the surrender flag that has flown over so many drug efforts. We're running up a battle flag.
this scourge will stop. But regrettably, back in Central America and in the jungle,
I remember down in Central America, we were refueling planes full of cocaine coming into the U.S., and it was a CIA operation being run by the White House.
At the same time all of the cocaine from Nicaragua was flowing into the U.S., Freeway Ricky Ross was at his heyday.
The average week would at least be $2 to $3 million, almost guaranteed. Some days we would have $2 and $3 million days.
After Freeway Rick was arrested, an investigative journalist by the name of Gary Webb uncovered a link that connected him back to the Nicaraguan Contra movement.
I read Dark Alliance. I got a copy personally from Gary Webb himself. And to read the book, it was fascinating for me. You know, to find out that I was connected with the CIA and all these high-powered people up in the government.
Ricky Ross was just lucky. He just happened to get a source who was connected to the CIA.
For a long time in South Central, the buzzword was that the CIA was selling crack. And I said, no, the CIA wasn't selling crack. The CIA was importing cocaine. Ricky Ross got it, turned it into crack, and he sold it.
According to Gary Webb's Dark Alliance, when Danilo Blandón was displaced from his home country of Nicaragua, he set off to America to raise money to aid the Contras in ridding his home from the invading Sandinistas. When Ricky Ross was introduced to Blandón, Blandón was in a position to create a pipeline of cocaine that he in turn gave to Ricky Ross on consignment.
Which I like the sound of that, you know, because I was always trying to get to the top anyway.
Suddenly, some major sources opened up for him. Danilo Blandón, Norwin Meneses, both of whom were tied to the CIA and the Contras, and Gary Webb did a masterful job of breaking those stories and proving with documents that that was the case.
Whatever we were running in LA, it goes
the profit was going to the Contra revolution.
I started doing a little research on my own, and I read a little bit about Oliver North and the Contras, because I never knew what the Contras was before.
There's ledgers of Oliver North and them actually transporting the cocaine to our country. There's film. Every piece of document that's possible.
There have been a lot of allegations thrown around, but the Contra resupply operation was involved in cocaine trafficking.
We found absolutely no evidence during my tenure at the NSC that any of the resistance leaders were themselves or their subordinates involved in drug running.
Although there was enough evidence to warrant investigation into CIA drug trafficking, there was no serious interest on the part of committee members, and no first-hand witnesses were called. At one point, the hearings were disrupted by two observers who burst out in protest. For these actions, the protesters were handed down stiff jail sentences of over a year each.
They never got into drugs, even though it kept coming up in their face. They had got declassified a lot of memos from Robert Owen in which he was telling Oliver North that there were Contra leaders who were involved in the drug traffic. The only questions they allowed him this was to sort of smooth it over or to blame it on somebody else.
The news program over the weekend suggested that Rob Owen, who testified earlier, was involved in drug smuggling. Now, is there any truth to that? Can you shed any light for us on that subject?
Absolutely false. Mr. Owen is the last person, perhaps right beside me, that would ever be engaged in those kinds of activities.
In the early 1980s, when the CIA was working to establish a southern front in Costa Rica in the war against Nicaragua, a relationship was established with John Hull, an American rancher living in Costa Rica. There is mounting evidence that the airstrips on Hull's ranch became not only a delivery point for illegal Contra weapon shipments from the U.S., but were also used for transporting cocaine into the United States.
You have CI bases in Costa Rica and Honduras. You have airplanes flying back and forth continuously, landing at bases in the United States where they don't have to go through regular customs, with the CI escorting the people in and out in a certain laissez-faire in the attitude at best of the customs, if there is, any customs representation there. So it's a dream situation for drug smugglers.
George Morales, who is now serving 32 years in federal prison for drug smuggling, once ran an air transport business in Florida. In 1984, while under indictment for smuggling marijuana, he was approached by the CIA.
You have to understand what situation. I was in the business, drug business, for a long time, and I didn't have no need for me to go to Costa Rica in order to fly back to the United States. Being in Colombia, it's very easy for me to go down there and get my connection and bring the cocaine back straight from Colombia. I got involved with these people in 1984, right after my indictment. They approached me with different questions to how to help the fight against the communists, because I was going to get in exchange for my help. I was going to get some type of deal, let me put it that way, in which they were going to be able to take care of my legal problem. They told me that they were going to go on to Washington and talk to these people in Washington. And in many occasions, they told me the name of Elliot Abrams and George Bush. They had some drugs, cocaine, in San Jose, Costa Rica, which they needed to bring it back to the United States. I was told to send the planes with the supplies to exchange, which we did. And we came back with some drugs from Costa Rica.
Did you come back with cocaine?
Yes, we came back with cocaine.
Gary Betzner, who is also serving time for drug smuggling, worked as a pilot for George Morales.
George said he wanted me to fly a couple loads of guns and bring coke back from Costa Rica. And he gave me the directions to John Hull's ranch, who's a CIA operative in Costa Rica. I left approximately midnight. I arrived at John Hull's ranch about 7 o'clock in the morning. Offloaded the guns, loaded 500 keys of cocaine on the plane. I gassed the aircraft myself, loaded it, and departed. And each time I did it, I paid myself 20 kilos, which is approximately 400,000.
Eventually, when this was brought to the attention of the FBI and the assistant U.S. attorney in Miami, they went down and conducted some kind of investigation of this. Hull's name came up. Hull refused to be interviewed. Hull and his friends phoned Washington. Washington alerted Oliver North. Oliver North somehow got the Justice Department in Washington to phone down to the U.S. Attorney's office in Miami, and apparently the U.S. Attorney was told to go very slow on his investigation.
But CIA involvement in the drug business did not start in Central America. It dates back at least as far as the Vietnam War.
Well, the three men, Shackley and Singlaub and Secord, were all working together from different countries on the huge CIA secret war in Laos. Our allies were the opium-growing tribesmen, and this meant that we continued in a very large way not only to support but really to augment a flow of heroin. This had to be run with the knowledge and the approval of the people who were in charge of these air operations. And these air operations had been controlled in the 66-68 period by General Secord.
The way the dynamics worked is that you're a young or middle-grade case officer or pilot on Air America, the CIA Airlines, or CAT, Civil Air Transport, and this general and his family or his aides get on the plane and they have suitcases that you know damn well is full of heroin. Now, you don't really have the authority to throw them off. It's kind of more their country than yours. And if you do, you're going to lose your job and have the whole weight of the CIA coming down on you. Whereas if you just smile and fly them and then get them down to the base in whatever capital you're going to and take them through customs if necessary, help them through, you know, you're doing your job, you're making money, no questions asked.
Despite our best efforts, illegal cocaine is coming into our country at alarming levels, and 4 to 5 million people regularly use it. 500,000 Americans are hooked on heroin. 1 in 12 persons smokes marijuana regularly.
Our job is never easy because drug criminals are ingenious. They work every day to plot a new and better way to steal our children's lives, just as they've done by developing this new drug, crack. For every door that we close, they open a new door to death.
This administration is impossible to embarrass to begin with. I mean, they rely on the old rule of deny, 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 despite the vast amounts of evidence that is available. And as we talked earlier, there is the tendency within the Congress and within large sections of, first of all, the establishment media, simply to reject this sort of thing. It can't be happening. If Nancy Reagan is saying just no to drugs, how can, drugs be running by the same freedom fighters that she embraces at various banquets?
The weapons trade and the narcotics trade in the world are 2 of the top 5 major money-making transactions in the whole world. These 2 major commodities in the world are hundreds of billions of dollars that go on. They could pay the money of the national debt for whole countries. In fact, Jorge Ochoa and Pablo Escobar agreed to pay the entire national debt of Colombia if, in fact, Colombia would agree not to allow them to be extradited. And it would still leave both of these guys multi-billionaires. So the amount of money that we're talking about here is absolutely gargantuan. And all that the intelligence community, these guys have gone outside the governmental structures, are tapping into hundreds of millions, which they need to run their operations.
The Golden Triangle,
In China in 1949, the Communists under Mao Zedong drove out the U.S.-backed nationalist warlord Chiang Kai-shek with his defeated army, the KMT, the Kuomintang. They fled to the Golden Triangle and to Taiwan. Within the Golden Triangle, they took over opium production to finance weapons purchases and the finer things in life. By the 1950s, heroin had become a nationwide concern in the United States. From Senate hearings to popular movies, criminologists blamed addicts for soaring crime rates. These KMT operations were hidden from the U.S. public for 30 years, and it is only recently Afghanistan has captured 90% of the world heroin market. The U.S. exploited the Hmong and Montagnard tribesmen as a source of opium and used the CIA's Air America to bring in guns and supplies in exchange for drugs. Large quantities of heroin appeared in the United States, much of it smuggled inside the bodies of dead American GIs. Addiction plagued the Army in Vietnam to the point of reducing their fighting capacity, and after the war these men brought their drug problem home with them. The U.S. government promoted the drug traffic and intervened to make sure traffic would not be discovered. In the words of one former investigator, quote, "You'd be running a criminal investigation, say narcotics. You'd find out that Inspector so-and-so of your national police is involved in this. You investigate up to a point and you can't go any further. It would go to our headquarters and then it would go to Washington, and nothing would ever happen. The intelligence gleaned from these people was more important than stopping the drug traffic." The senior public relations man for the DEA offers the explanation, quote, "Their mission was to get people to fight against the communists, not to stop the drug traffic." Iran-Contra. A secret program by the Reagan Administration circumvented Congress and illegally sold weapons to Iran, a terrorist nation, in order to pay for a guerrilla war against the Sandinista Nicaraguan government. When the operation was uncovered, it also uncovered an off-the-books operation that, in the words of Senator Daniel Inouye, was a secret government with its own permanent funding mechanism and its own Army, Navy, and Air Force. The exposure of the Iran-Contra operation revealed the tip of the iceberg. Admiral Richard Secord ran a many-faceted program that concentrated on banking fraud, drug smuggling, and illegal arms dealing by officers and former officers of the U.S. military. Oliver L. North, a Marine lieutenant colonel, was assigned to the National Security Council staff beginning in 1981 until he was fired in 1986. North was the White House official most directly involved in secretly aiding the Contras, selling arms to Iran, and diverting Iran arms sales proceeds to the Contras. North was Deputy Director for Political Military Affairs and reported to his superior National Security Advisor, Robert C. McFarland, and later John M. Poindexter. He claimed to have taken much of his direction from Central Intelligence Agency Director William Casey. North testified repeatedly that he believed President Reagan was aware and approving of his activities. North was indicted in 1988 on 16 Iran-Contra charges. He was found guilty on 3 counts. His convictions were vacated in 1990 when an appeals court found that witnesses in his trial were prejudiced by his immunized congressional testimony. Many figures that came under criminal investigation and prosecution in Iran-Contra, like John Poindexter, Elliot Abrams, Richard Armitage, Dick Cheney, Otto Reich, Colin Powell, and John Negroponte, returned to serve in both Bush administrations without serious challenge from Congress. The Contras and the Crips. A San Francisco Bay Area drug ring sold tons of cocaine to the Crips and Blood street gangs of Los Angeles, funneled millions in profits directly to the Contra guerrillas, run by the Central Intelligence Agency. This drug network opened the first pipeline between Colombia's cocaine cartels and the black neighborhoods of Los Angeles, a city now known as the crack capital of the world. Gary Webb broke the story that no other major newspaper would run. and was found murdered in what can only be described as a staged suicide.
My name is Gary Webb. I am an investigative journalist. I've been an investigative journalist for about 25 years for daily newspapers. And in 1996, I wrote a series of stories entitled Dark Alliance, which was about CIA involvement in drug trafficking. What my story showed was that the cocaine that was being sold in those neighborhoods was coming from mainly one source, and this one source was being used to finance a guerrilla war in Central America. The general idea of the CIA dealing drugs was something that the American mainstream press had never written about before, and that's why it prompted outrage among blacks, among drug reform activists, among politicians, by the CIA, by every federal agency involved in the drug war, because it showed they weren't doing their jobs, that it was a fraud. Right after we published the stories, the support we got from the media was very favorable. Newsweek magazine did a big piece on the story and said it was well documented and well researched. The website was getting like 1 million hits a day. There were marches in Watts, there were marches in Compton, there were candlelight vigils. Every California senator demanded an official investigation. So the story itself was really building momentum. The government reaction was no reaction. And this, I believe, was a very careful strategy, because nobody was going to believe the government if they came out and said we didn't do it. The proof was fairly overwhelming, since we had all these government documents showing that it had happened. So what happened was they let the so-called liberal press speak for them. And they had the national security reporters at the Washington Post, who coincidentally used to work for the CIA, write stories saying it doesn't mean anything. It was a distraction from what the story said, and it became sort of a media war between the Mercury News, which stood behind the story at that point, and the rest of the establishment media, who wanted us to back away from it. And part of that reason was because these major newspapers had written about this issue back in the 1980s, but had written about it very dismissively, as if this is nonsense, it doesn't happen, it never happened. And then 10 years later, we came back with documentation showing that it was absolutely true, and that it was worse than we thought. We had gotten a story out around them, and we had gotten it out in a big way that they couldn't control, and that was through the internet. And I think a lot of this was directed to the Mercury News to say, we don't care what documentation you have, we don't care what kind of story you've got, we set the national news agenda. And if we don't like your story, we will kill your story regardless of its truth. The media rejoiced when this came out because it meant they had won. They had forced a newspaper to back away from a story that was true, simply because of this barrage of criticism, of mindless criticism essentially, that really took its toll on the editors of the newspaper. And they were being seen as sort of outcasts from the club. And I think they made a political decision that it was better in the long run to take a dive on this story and get back in the good graces of the rest of the media. It was essentially a war between my editors and myself, because I wouldn't apologize for the story or back away from the story, and fought them on it publicly. And so they transferred me to a bureau that was 140 miles from where I lived, and I called in sick a lot. One of the things I'm proudest of in regards to that story is the website that the Mercury News set up, because it really was the first time that a newspaper brought its readers not only into the interior of the paper, but into the reporters' notebooks. You know, this was a story that, as I told my editors, had a very high unbelievability factor built into it. A lot of people were going to say, this can't be true. And this story became a sensation because of the website, not because of the story, but because people could get to it. And they could never have gotten to it before because the San Jose Mercury News is a small regional newspaper in Northern California that you couldn't read if you lived in New York, or you couldn't read if you lived in LA. But this story you could read anywhere in the world and see all of our documentation. So it became, and we did this on purpose to make it very hard to knock down, to make it very difficult for people to say this didn't happen. But they said it didn't happen anyway.
Here is Jane Pauley.
A super secret organization like the CIA is going to have secrets, but this sounded too bizarre to be true. Yet there it was, in print, in a respected newspaper. The accusation that the crack epidemic, which ravaged this country's cities, was spread with help from a secret army linked to the CIA. As you may recall, the story set off a firestorm of controversy. Then last month, a surprising twist. The newspaper which had first published this astounding story started to back away from it. Is the story true or not? Tonight, Bob McEwen takes a second look.
We are sick and tired of your excuses.
And I hope that you will help to put an end to it, because we are tired and we're hurt and we're angry.
I will tell you, Director Deutsch, as a former Los Angeles police narcotics detective, that the agency has dealt drugs throughout this country for a long time.
It was an American first. The director of the CIA, one of the country's most secretive institutions, facing the public at a town meeting in South Central Los Angeles.
If this information turns up wrongdoing, we will bring the people to justice and make them accountable.
An extraordinary event in response to an extraordinary accusation that people working with the CIA had a hand in sparking the crack epidemic that has devastated America's inner cities. Those charges came from this man, reporter Gary Webb of the San Jose Mercury News. He became one of the most talked about journalists in the country, his story the most controversial of the past year, because after investigating the origins of the crack epidemic, he claimed he found a link leading right to the CIA.
Men who were working for the CIA's army were responsible for bringing all that cocaine into Los Angeles that sparked the crack epidemic.
The CIA's army, Webb says, were the Contras, the anti-communist rebels fighting the government of Nicaragua back in the 1980s, an army founded and funded by the CIA. Webb wrote that some Contra supporters smuggled cocaine to America to raise money for their cause.
The CIA has been bringing drugs into this country.
As then CIA Director John Deutsch discovered, it's an accusation that rings true for many, especially for some in the African American community. And Webb's story has taken on a life of its own.
And Gary,
on the talk show circuit and the internet, some have even gone beyond Webb's charges to accuse the CIA of conspiring to target young African Americans.
Was the CIA willing to poison our cities and crack cocaine?
On the basis of what you learned, do you believe that there was a conscious decision, a meeting where someone sat down and said, we're going to poison the youth of Black America and here's how we're going to do it?
No, I don't. These guys were looking to raise money, and I don't think it mattered to them where they did it. They just went where they could raise the money.
Gary Webb says his stories were largely based on the testimony of a drug dealer with Contra connections who became a U.S. government witness. But 9 months after the series was published, the controversy continues. Some of the heavyweights of American journalism have examined Webb's work and found it reckless, often wrong. Just this week, Webb was pulled off the CIA story after his own executive editor admitted the articles oversimplified the origins of the crack epidemic and left out important conflicting evidence. He also wrote, I feel that we did not have proof that top CIA officials knew. But despite the evidence to the contrary, Gary Webb insists his stories were substantially accurate. And many Americans do seem willing to believe that their own government could have been involved in drug smuggling. So was the U.S. government involved in any way? Dateline decided to take a second look. Crack use spread like wildfire in the early 1980s. And in Los Angeles, a drug dealer known as Freeway Ricky Ross was in the middle of it. Prosecutors called Ross the Walmart of crack. He made millions in the early 80s dealing to Los Angeles street gangs. Police say he was among the first to take expensive cocaine powder and cook it into low-cost, highly addictive crack, then distribute it through the gangs. Webb says Freeway Ricky helped trigger an epidemic of human misery.
It's destroyed our community. All the black men are in prison, most of us.
Rick Ross is now serving a life sentence for cocaine distribution.
The women are still strung on the drugs, kids without fathers, without mothers.
And honestly, how much responsibility do you have for that?
A lot. A lot of it was my fault. I played the game.
Police in Los Angeles say he virtually cornered the crack market, thanks to a steady supply of cheap cocaine. A pipeline so good that Ross was able to introduce crack to other cities, using his gang contacts, and to make himself, he says, a very rich man. On your best day, how much money did you see?
A couple million, 2, 3 maybe.
A day.
On a good day.
How many days like that were there?
A few. Quite a few.
Rick Ross's drug supplier did have connections to the Contras. Dateline has been able to confirm that from former Contra leader Eden Pastora. And Pastora admits he received some aid from that drug supplier. But Pastora says he was not aware of any CIA drug connection. So we asked Gary Webb, where is the evidence the CIA knew of any drug dealing?
You have to define the CIA. If you're saying that people who were working with the CIA know they were doing it, yeah. Did the director of the Central Intelligence Agency know this? I don't know.
This is nonsense.
Now retired, Dewey Claridge was the CIA's man in charge of Central America in the early 80s. He insists the agency had nothing to do with any drug trafficking or with any cover-up.
Oh, don't give me the conspiracy bullshit. Come on, you're a more intelligent man than that. Well, come on. I mean, come on. Listen. There has never been a conspiracy in this country.
Never? Gary Webb's version of events may be wrong, but in the mid-1980s, there was a high-level White House conspiracy called Iran-Contra. Whatever you believe, Gary Webb's stories have revived interest in an issue that's been simmering since Ronald Reagan was at the White House. Were U.S. government officials aware of drug smuggling in and around the Contra movement? And did they simply choose to ignore it? One U.S. senator says, absolutely.
There's no question in my mind there is a complicity in the flow of drugs into this country, period.
A Senate investigation led by John Kerry of Massachusetts found that individuals who provided support for the Contras were involved in drug trafficking, and that one or another agency of the U.S. government had information regarding the involvement, either while it was occurring or immediately thereafter. Incredibly, according to Senator Kerry, smugglers even used the U.S. government's own airlift operation at El Salvador's Ilopango Airport to get cocaine back across the American border. This drug enforcement agent patrolled that same airport in the mid-'80s.
It was just nonstop traffic coming and going, and nobody ever inspected their planes or their cargo or whatever.
Celerino Castillo told Dateline he observed rampant drug smuggling at that airport.
Well, what we had was that we had Contra pilots flying out of Ilopango, smuggling drugs into the U.S., cocaine specifically.
He claims the smuggling was so open it had to be condoned by the U.S. government. Castillo says planes would arrive filled with supplies for the Contras, then leave carrying cocaine for America, bound for military airfields in Florida and Texas, offloaded out of sight of the law, then shipped to California and other points in the U.S. And there's more. Castillo says when he reported all of this to his bosses at the DEA, he was told to ignore it.
So you were told point blank? Point blank, stay away from it. It's a covert operation being run by the White House.
In a letter to Dateline, the Drug Enforcement Administration said it has vigorously investigated, and no evidence has ever been found to substantiate Mr. Castillo's charges. As for the CIA, it's denied ever aiding or condoning drug smuggling.
Reports were reaching the highest councils of our government, in the White House and in the Justice Department. There is no question of that. I can document that.
The White House and Justice Department disputed Kerry's report at the time, but he still believes some government officials turned a blind eye towards drug dealing in the mid-1980s, after the time at the heart of Gary Webb's stories. There were no indictments or prosecutions, and ultimately those allegations of drug smuggling became just a footnote in the scandal known as Iran-Contra. According to Kerry, at the time, American officials were more afraid of the evils of communism than the ravages of crack cocaine.
I'll tell you, South Central Los Angeles and every other city in America are owed an explanation. People knew that drug trafficking was getting mixed up in the flow of weapons. People knew there were bad types involved in this operation. They didn't turn off the spigot. That's plain and simple.
The CIA is reviewing the charges made by Webb and says it will conclude its investigation by the end of the year. The House Select Committee on Intelligence says it will issue its own report and that its investigation will not be affected by the Mercury News' reevaluation of its series.
But there was more disturbing news in the fall of 1993 when a report revealed that the government itself may have been running drugs. The head of the DEA at the time, Robert Bonner, said that a ton of pure cocaine worth hundreds of millions of dollars had been smuggled into the United States. And he blamed the CIA, saying the agency had joined the Venezuelan National Guard in drug smuggling.
Let me understand what you're saying. A ton of cocaine was smuggled into the United States of America by the Venezuelan National Guard?
Well, they...
In cooperation with the CIA?
That's exactly what appears to have happened.
Bonner said he was the only one who could have approved transportation of illegal narcotics such as cocaine, and that this shipment had entered the country without his authorization.
Let me put it this way, Mike. If this has not been approved by DEA or an appropriate law enforcement authority in the United States, then it's illegal. It's called drug trafficking. It's called drug smuggling.
Former DEA agent Levine said that equally shocking was the fact that for more than 30 years, the federal government had protected some drug dealers.
As officers in the narcotic war, we saw the political choice made up close and personal.
One example, Levine said, was during the Nixon administration when he was about to bust a major source of heroin.
And I was stopped cold, because that source were our allies in the Vietnam War.
Levine said this was not an isolated incident, that it had happened many times in his 25-year career.
If it was a question of supporting people who supported our economic and political philosophies in other parts of the world, and they happened to be drug dealers, as most of them are, we supported them and we protected them. We protected them by looking the other way.
And the drug dealers had another ally in the war: money.
The average week would at least be $2 to $3 million, almost guaranteed. Some days we would have $2 and $3 million days.
After Freeway Rick was arrested, an investigative journalist by the name of Gary Webb uncovered a link that connected him back to the Nicaraguan Contra movement.
I read Dark Alliance. I got a copy personally from Gary Webb himself. And to read the book, it was fascinating for me. You know, to find out that I was connected with the CIA and all these high-powered people up in the government.
Ricky Ross was just lucky. He just happened to get a source who was connected to the CIA.
For a long time in South Central, the buzzword was that the CIA was selling crack. And I said, no, the CIA wasn't selling crack. The CIA was importing cocaine. Ricky Ross got it, turned it into crack, and he sold it.
According to Gary Webb's Dark Alliance, when Danilo Blandón was displaced from his home country of Nicaragua, he set off to America to raise money to aid the Contras in ridding his home from the invading Sandinistas. When Ricky Ross was introduced to Blandón, Blandón was in a position to create a pipeline of cocaine that he in turn gave to Ricky Ross on consignment.
Which I like the sound of that, you know, because I was always trying to get to the top anyway.
Thank you so much for joining us today. You know, yesterday we were in San Diego, California, talking with one of the country's most notorious drug dealers, Mr. Ricky Ross, better known as Freeway Rick. Take a look at this tape.
I think I'm an expert on cocaine. There's not many people that has dealt with as much cocaine as I have. I think I'm an expert. I saw people strung out from snorting cocaine, where they snort cocaine all day long. I saw them take powder and put it in cigarettes and smoke it, just like a rock smoker will. And they'll smoke back to back to back.
Well, Ricky Ross is right now facing a life sentence, but he says he deserves to be a free man. Why? Because he says the CIA used him as a pawn to sell drugs to help fund a secret war in Nicaragua. Take a look at this tape.
If it was good for them to sell drugs, then it should have been good for me to sell drugs. The money from the drugs went to buy guns for the Contras.
Now, Ricky Ross compared himself to Superfly, the character from the 1970s movie, who seemed to have it all.
Cocaine was like a situation like party, you know, like have fun, you know, like it's like just being cool, you know. It wasn't nothing negative about it, you know. It was never, we didn't ever see a crack mother. It wasn't no crack mothers. It wasn't nobody strung out on cocaine. It was like the people that was buying, you know, made $500–600 a week, drove brand new cars, had nice looking women, wore nice clothes, you know what I'm saying?
But Ricky Ross lost it all when he was arrested on cocaine trafficking charges last year. And Ricky Ross is right now at the center of one of the country's biggest controversies when it comes to drug. And I'm going to tell you something, if this controversy continues to escalate the way it has, and it will, I think this country is going to stop for a second and say it's wake-up call time. I think right now what we need to do is try to figure out whether or not there's any truth to this. So today we're going to discuss it. And my first guest worked for the government of the United States, for the Drug Enforcement Agency, for 25 years. He recently wrote a book called Triangle of Death, which he wrote and says it was written as fiction because if you had written it as fact, well, please welcome Mr. Michael Levine to the show. You know, if you had written this book as a fact and told some of the true stories that you could tell, what would happen?
I just couldn't. Let me explain why.
Certainly.
I was a deep cover agent. Deep cover agents are a small group of people who pose as criminals and go into other countries. For instance, the Arab terrorist role in the book is one I actually played. And we are sent into these countries to live on our acting ability. There's no 911 to call. The mission is to reach the top of the drug world. And I was a deep cover agent. I lived with Chinese drug dealers in Bangkok, Thailand during the Vietnam War. I lived with ex-Nazis and Argentine mass murderers in Argentina.
At that time you weren't a DEA agent.
No, I was in the hard narcotics smuggling unit of customs, and the case that I was living with these Chinese drug dealers led me right to Chiang Mai. It was the first case that was killed by Central Intelligence. Ironically, it was a case that involved the smuggling of heroin into the U.S. in the dead bodies of GIs. Now, this was my first instance where I was brought into the embassy in the middle of the night. I was being forced by my government, mysteriously, suddenly to lie to the drug dealers. All logistic support was withdrawn. And the drug dealers had bought my act. I get over pretty good. I grew up in the South Bronx. My brother was a heroin addict. As a matter of fact, I grew up, I'm a Jew who grew up in a Puerto Rican black neighborhood. And as a kid, I used to lie and say I'm half Puerto Rican. So I was kind of undercover, like right away, right from the get-go. It was good training.
You trained yourself well from a young age.
And I was a bad kid. I was arrested twice before I was 16. Had I been arrested 1 week later, I could never have been a federal agent. They were considered juvenile offenses. I wanted to live out a James Bond fantasy. I got into a fight with a guy. I was a heavyweight boxer, a martial artist when I was in the military. And in a heartbeat, I learned how short life is. The guy pulled a gun, stuck it in my stomach. A fellow military policeman pulled the trigger and it misfired. From that time on, I wanted to live out every fantasy I could, and I aimed myself to be a deep cover agent. Well, there's a poor kid from the Bronx. How do you get to live that kind of life? And I did. I lived out every fantasy you could imagine.
And over 25 years, you did this all over the world.
All over the world. Every country we name in the book, I was there.
And name the countries that you name in the book.
Well,
from Bangkok, Thailand, Buenos Aires, Argentina. I lived there for 3 years. Mexico, Colombia, Panama, Bolivia, Germany, France, you name it. I've been there posing as a criminal. And in every case, including probably the biggest case in our history, I reached the top of the drug world. And to go back to the original question, and let me get to what happened when I reached the top of the drug world. The original question is, why can't I tell this as nonfiction? Well, when you become a deep cover agent, you're in violation of these countries' laws. If you screw up, you die. There's no doubt about it, and agents have died. In fact, the death I write about, the tortured death, the one that's linked to CIA, comes from real life. You die. So the one rule that you live by is, and they tell this to you, resolve every situation in your own favor. And it is better to be tried by 12 than carried by 6. Now, when you live that rule, even though I was watching my brother die, a heroin addict, die inch by inch, and even though I believed I was doing right, I knew I was doing a lot of wrong things to survive. Anybody who does that has to survive, has to do everything they can. Now, the point is, when you live by that rule, you can't come out and talk about it. So you unwittingly join the U.S. government mafia, of which part the CIA is the kingpin, the Don.
So you're saying that the CIA is the kingpin of the head of the United States Mafia?
I've put thousands of people in jail, thousands. DEA gave a British writer once a figure of 3,000. It was a lot more than that. I've never failed in putting a case before court, conspiracy cases, undercover cases. I've never lost a case. You know, in every one of these cases, what I'm talking about is I have a lot of credibility. I live by my credibility. So when I say I have personal testimony about Central Intelligence killing, murdering cases, one case, the biggest drug case I think in our history, Operation Trifecta, was a case where, posing as a mafia don, Luis Miguel Garcia, we went to Bolivia. We plugged into a pipeline of massive amounts of cocaine going from Bolivia through Mexico with the protection of the Mexican army into California. Both the CIA and the State Department and the Justice Department ganged up to kill that case.
To stop the case?
To murder that case. Absolutely murder that case. Well, there's several reasons. First, all I can do is testify as I would in federal court as to what happened. I'm in Panama. We ordered 15 tons of cocaine to go through Mexico, be paid for in Panama, into the U.S. from Bolivia.
Stop there for a second, Michael. You're in Panama. You are a deep cover agent for the United States.
Suddenly, all logistics support is taken away.
But wait a second. But they told you, as a deep cover agent, to buy cocaine and send it through this country and bring it into the United States of America.
To catch the cocaine was never intended to reach the U.S. It was going to be sold to undercover agents. The important thing to know is that we plugged into a pipeline that existed for years.
Okay.
And that pipeline, massive amounts of cocaine were flowing from Bolivia, also Colombia. We learned that during this investigation. Massive amounts were going onto the streets of the U.S. At that time, I already knew my daughter was a cocaine addict. I had already lost, my brother at that time had already committed suicide. He wrote a note to my family and friends, I just can't stand the drugs anymore, 19 years of addiction. So there I am at the biggest case in our history, at the top of the drug world. I'm in Panama, in a country that was being run by a CIA employee, basically, Manuel Noriega, and my government suddenly withdraws logistics support, and I and then the other Chicano-Mexican undercover agent, we were forced to lie. We were forced to lie to these people who could kill us in a heartbeat, because our government had withdrawn logistics support. In a screaming argument I had midnight, and I describe it in a nonfiction book, my DEA supervisor tells me, as an explanation, the CIA is in this in 4 countries. We're not telling you everything.
Okay, no, wait, I got to hold you there for a second, so I have to take a break. But the reason why Michael is here today is because we are going to talk about this entire thing that's rumbling all over America. Was the CIA responsible for, in any way, shape, or form, funneling cocaine into the United States of America, helping to turn it into crack, and turning it into what is now devastated the majority of the inner cities of America? A lot of people say that this is just another bull case drawn up by black people who are just so paranoid to say that everything is a conspiracy. But today you're going to meet several people who are former employees of our United States government, people who have looked at this over years, who will say, whether it was a conspiracy or not, they don't want to talk about it. But did the CIA know that drugs were coming into the United States of America and help it get here? The answer to the question is yes.
Absolutely.
Does the CIA do this on a regular basis? The answer to the question is
absolutely. I wish I could take them to court.
And right now, just by virtue of the fact that Montel Williams is doing the show, someone is going to say, you see, it's another black journalist who is feeding into the conspiracy story. And most of you who know me know I'm probably one of the most conservative people in this country. I spent 20 years in the United States government working for the military. This show is about finding some truth and saying to the American people, let us get the answers that we demand, because it's our dollars that paid to bring Coke to America. We'll be back right after this. We're talking today, this is really a show about what we can call rumors. The rumor that the CIA was involved in making sure that cocaine made it to the streets of South Central LA back in the early 80s, and then helped to develop and turn it into crack, which was then spread across America, and is the reason why most of our inner cities are in the plight that they are in. And a lot of this has been out there for years, but it wasn't until recently that the story broke again. And my next guest is a reporter, not from San Diego, California, but from San Jose Mercury News, and he wrote a story called The Dark Alliance. Please welcome Mr. Gary Webb to the show. And Gary, this really, I think the current fervor over this issue is because of your article. A lot of people may not be familiar with what the Dark Alliance meant and stands for. Why don't you tell America what the story is about first, and then we'll talk about the issues.
It was about a cocaine ring that operated along the west coast of the United States throughout most of the 80s. And they were funneling, they were selling cocaine in South Central. They were also selling it in Oakland. They were selling it in San Francisco. They were selling it in San Jose. And some of the money they were making was going to support an army that the men who ran the cocaine ring worked for, called the FDN. This was an army that the CIA started in 1981 and supported.
Better known to us, most of us who remember news, the Contras from Nicaragua. So go right ahead.
The men that were running the cocaine ring were top officials of this Contra army. And what we found was that they were selling this stuff in South Central, which is, predominantly black section of Los Angeles, immediately before the outbreak of the crack cocaine epidemic. They started selling powder. Tons and tons and tons of powder cocaine was going into this one small area of the city. And from there, they sold it to Freeway Rick. And Freeway Rick took the powder, turned it into crack, and starting in 1983, 1984, began distributing it to predominantly the gangs, the Crips and the Bloods in Los Angeles. And they spread it, from there.
From there. Now, since this has happened, you have butted heads with everybody in Washington, D.C., trying to get information about the story. Have you not?
Yeah, we worked on this for a year, and it was only because, some people at National Archives believe freedom of information means freedom of information. We got some documents that showed that pretty strongly there were some CIA connections to this.
Let's talk a little bit about those documents for a second, because there's a gentleman, this figure that we talked about yesterday on the show. His name is Blandón, Danilo Blandón, who was a person who was a member of the aristocracy of Nicaragua before the fall of Somoza, and then he fled and comes to the United States and decides, while he's in the United States, so you can all understand this, he wants to raise money for the revolutionaries who are trying to overthrow the government that just overthrew them. So here in the United States, they try to do fundraisers, and that doesn't work. And then Blandón gets a scheme. Well, I can get some cocaine cheaply with some help from some of my friends and get it into the United States of America. All I need to find is somebody who can sell it. So they find a gentleman by the name of Rick Ross, who is Freeway Rick. Rick Ross comes in and starts selling cocaine at the terms beginning 1 or 2 grams. And within weeks, 2, 3, 4 kilos a week. Within months, what was it, 10 to 15 kilos a day. Ricky Ross was selling cocaine to the point of making $3 to $4 million a day. He sold so much cocaine, it hurt his fingers to count the money. Not only in Los Angeles, but in Cincinnati, in St. Louis, all the way across America. So some can say, and this is the reason why people are so angry at you in your article, is that Ricky Ross, the dope dealer, was supplied by the CIA because Blandón was an operative for the CIA, correct?
Blandón and Meneses were working for an army that was a wholly owned subsidiary of the CIA. They were meeting with CIA agents. Blandón, and this came out in court. I mean, Danilo Blandón is now a government witness. He works for the Drug Enforcement Administration, and we've paid him, I don't know, $166,000 over the last 18 months because he's such a good informant. So they put him on the witness stand in Ricky Ross's case, and he testified that in 1981, he went to Honduras, he met with the commander, the military commander of the CIA's army, and he was instructed to go raise money in California for this Contra army. And he was told that the ends justified the means.
And those ends being sell cocaine if you have to.
Well, look, he was in the room with the Nicaraguan representative of the Cali cartel, Mr. Meneses, and he was in the room with a government marketing expert named Danilo Blandón. Now, if they weren't talking about selling cocaine, I don't know what they were talking about.
And this is all information they can find on a website. I have to use that website, but on a website on the internet. So we're going to put that up so people can go and
look at these documents
take a look at the documents yourself and judge it. But Michael, now, I mean, there's a stretch here. Here's a guy who is obviously a CIA operative, Mr. Blandón, who is working with this government-backed army that we've kind of created in Nicaragua. But how the heck does this guy get to bring in tons of cocaine? When I say ton, I'm talking tons. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 tons of cocaine weekly in the United States of America for 7 years, and no one can ever catch him.
Well, number one, Mr. Meneses was actually indicted in 1984. He was known within, my own sources in DEA told me he was known as El Rey de la Droga, the king of drugs. He was in more than 40 files and indicted mysteriously, and people within DEA say that it was CIA intervention that kept this sealed indictment from ever being opened. So he was well known. He's well known. The connection between him, Blandón, and Calero, who was the head of the Nicaraguan government in exile, is clear. There's a clear evidentiary.
We got a picture of it.
Yeah, there's a clear evidentiary trail. Now, if you want to follow that trail up, you have to first understand how CIA and DEA work. I was a country attaché assigned to Argentina. Now, during those years, there were people who I inherited on the payroll who were murderers. They were also on the CIA payroll. So,
Murderers on the CIA payroll.
Not only murderers, I'm talking about mass murderers. And I wrote about it in books that I thought would have America marching on Washington. Nothing ever happened.
How are you alive today?
A miracle. Just absolutely.
Why didn't the CIA bump you off before you came to the Montel Williams show? Because to me, they will say tomorrow, he's a kook, he's crazy, don't believe anything he has to say, don't worry about it, there's no conspiracy.
Well, at the same time, DEA called me one of their best in a New York Times article. The only thing I can say, Montel, I lost my son, I lost my brother because of this phony CIA-backed drug flow. Somebody once said that if you don't have anything in your life to die for, you don't have anything to live for. And after losing my son, that's the story of my life. God bless Gary Webb. I've been trying to tell this, and other DEA agents are now coming out trying to tell this story.
Let me take a break. When we come back, we got a lot of people who disagree with all of this. They're here today. We're going to have a good argument. We'll be back right after this. My next guest is the Director of Media Analysis for Accuracy in Media, AIM, and says that what Mr. Webb wrote is incorrect. Please welcome Mr. Joe Goulden to the show. And also welcome the host of his own radio talk show on WWRC in Washington, D.C. Please welcome Mr. Joe Madison to the show. I say that Mr. Madison has dedicated the last 3 weeks of your broadcast?
Oh, no, it's been 7 weeks, 3 hours a day, 5 days a week.
To this issue?
To this issue. They will not allow me to talk about anything else. And when I say they, I mean the people in this 50,000-watt station from Philadelphia to the hills of West Virginia, black, white, Hispanic, every color you can imagine, every nationality, every economic, social group. People want to know. America wants to know.
And Mr. Goulden, you say that this is really out to lunch, right?
Montel, this is journalistic malpractice of the grossest sort, and we need an investigation of this, not where the CIA was in the drug business. That's been investigated ad infinitum, but why a supposedly respectable newspaper group such as the Night Rooter newspapers, would publish ill-sourced, contradictory stories that rely more upon innuendo and misinformation than fact.
Okay, well now when we talk about misinformation and innuendo, here's something Mike has right there. Mike, you have a document that I saw on a recent show, but this document is a transcript of Oliver North's diary, correct?
I can go on for the next 2 hours.
Oh, wait,
incidents where the CIA, and I put thousands of people away in jail, Mr. Goulden.
Mike, we're not arguing that. We're
a lot less.
Mike,
a lot less than you see here. This is Oliver North's
Mike,
diary.
that's great. That came out in the 1980s when they had 3 congressional committees, a special counsel, Lawrence
The only
Wall,
trouble with that was
butts
this
off on
was
it.
not given to Kerry. This was held back from Kerry.
And Walsh never investigated this.
And nobody has ever denied that people on the fringe of the Contra movement were involved in drug dealing. What this man has claimed is this was a CIA plot. More so now he's backed away from this claim. He tells the Washington Post incredibly, I didn't say CIA was doing this.
You know, one of the things
the man doesn't have the cowardice of his own
People have
convictions.
to understand about a CIA. People have to understand about a CIA whose chief of counterintelligence for 8 years sold America's top secrets as if it was a Bayonne, New Jersey garage sale, and nobody stopped him. The FBI had to fight CIA to arrest him, not CIA. So when you talk about, this is an agency that was experimenting with mind control drugs, putting LSD in the food of patients.
Don't forget the Abraham Lincoln assassination.
This is all, well, I mean, I'm talking about specific. Now let's talk about reality.
Wait, Mike,
if I could just say something. One of the things I've always noticed, and I hope I can do it without interruption, is that as soon as facts are being made, you'll notice as soon as he pulled out that document, interruption. Now let me tell you what we're asking for. Is a Congressional Records Act. In other words, let's take all of the records, classified and otherwise, put them out before the people, and let's see who knew what and when they knew it. Here's the accusation. The accusation isn't that agents were on the street corner selling drugs. The accusation is that drugs are being sold by the Contras and that the CIA knew about it and didn't do anything. That's the accusation. So what we need is a Records Act so that you and I and all of us. Now, if he says he knows what the CIA knows, he's saying more than the CIA is saying.
Joel, I know this for a fact. They put Eden Pastora out of business on the Southern Front. Commandante Zero, for instance. Alan Fears, who ran the Central American Task Force, testified to the Kerry Committee. Yes, there were people involved in the Contra movement who were doing drugs.
But that's what we said.
Well, yeah, but you have your time long.
The question is, does the CIA know?
We have Ricky Ross here starting the drug business in 1979 when Blandon was still in Managua. I talked to Adolfo Calera from Managua at length last week.
Another
he says,
CIA
I've never seen these guys. He ran the thing.
Yeah, we got a picture of him meeting with the drug dealer.
Let's stop for just a second. All the people of this country are asking for is let's investigate this. And the reason why is because for things like what Mike's been trying to show. Mike, if I could do it real quick, this is just an excerpt from Ollie North's diary where he says particularly about talking to this same person that Mike just said, that Mr. Golden said he talked to last week, Mr. Calero, the same person you talked to last week. It says in Ollie North's diary, contact him so we can get 1,500 kilos?
Well, what it says, we have to investigate. Okay. It's never been investigated. Quickly, this is just one piece of several hundred pages of Ollie North's diary reflecting drugs. It is a phone call from Dewey Claridge. Who is Dewey Claridge? He's a top CIA official who was convicted of lying to Congress and pardoned by President Bush. During this conversation, they speak of a phone call to Calero. Calero, there's a direct evidentiary chain. There's a direct evidentiary chain from Calero right to Ricky Ross. It's there to be investigated.
That's all.
In this, and mind you, there were 2 attempts at classifying this. In this, they reflect want aircraft to pick up 1,500 kilos. Now, I promise every one of you, if I, as a DEA agent, got this in your diary, you would have 100 DEA agents around you, around the clock. And this is one page of several hundred.
Well,
they've never been investigated.
Let me take.
Well, you tell me what.
Let me take a break.
Coffee.
Yeah.
Coffee.
Let me take a break. When we come back, we're going to be joined by Congressman Charles Rangel, who says that, you know what, all we want to know is the facts. Let's look at the facts and give us all an opportunity as citizens of this country to evaluate the facts. That's all everybody wants to do. Every American wants to know the truth. When we come back, we'll hear from an American who wants to know it. We'll be back right after this. Ladies and gentlemen, please Please welcome Congressman Charles Rangel to the show. And before we take even one more step, I'd like to be able to set this up for our viewers at home so they understand what we're talking about. What we're talking about here is that there is at least information that alludes to the fact that over an 8-year period of time, from 1982 until about 1988, there is a person who is a known paid informant for the CIA who is funneling drugs to a crack dealer, dope dealer in Los Angeles. This is the part that's a known fact for most of the information. This person was known to be a CIA operative. He is the person providing cocaine, tons of cocaine, that's coming into the United States under protection. No one ever busts him. His partner is the biggest drug dealer in Central America, a guy by the name of Meneses, who obviously is supplying to him. Everybody completely looks the wrong way. For 8 years, this gentleman, Ricky Ross, is able to sell his drugs with the assistance of this guy, Blandone, selling drugs all over the place, never gets busted. He goes to jail, is in jail, a month away from getting out of jail. The CIA or the DEA sets up an elaborate sting to bust him as soon as he walks out of jail. He's in jail, not selling any drugs. They set up a sting, bust him. Ricky Ross is now back in jail waiting sentencing for another bust that took place after he got out of jail the first time. So the question is, was the CIA, did they just turn their backs and allow drugs to come into America? If they did that, are they then not responsible for the epidemic of crack in America? That's the next conclusion that some people say. Well, other people may say no. The ends justify the means. If this was the only way we could pay for an army to fight overseas, that's the way we do it. But do we do that at the cost of American citizens? Congressman Rangel, what do you think?
I think that Congresswoman Maxine Waters and commentator Joe Madison, and of course my old buddy Mike and Webb here, will be able to say as a legacy that they're leaving to their children, that at long last someone pulled the reins in on the CIA. We are not just talking about whether or not they devastated communities throughout these United States. We're just saying that the CIA has been and is now completely out of control. And I don't understand, Montel, as to why all of America isn't completely outraged. You cannot target a black community with cocaine, with crack cocaine, any more than you could with poison gas without it destroying America. And as far as I'm concerned, the CIA is being charged with mass murder. And it's time for this allegation to be exposed, and it should not take 60 days to do it.
Mr. Golden, what do you say to this?
I think Charlie's jumping to conclusions here. We had 3 congressional committees look at this in depth in the 1980s, a special counsel. They found there was some stuff on the fringes of it. This is a germ of truth in Webb's fantasy articles here.
Can I ask you a question, Mr. Golden? Did we not just have 2 congressional committees look into the Persian Gulf syndrome and come back and say we had nothing to do with the fact that our soldiers and sailors are sick? Now, last week, they just came back and said, oh, by the way, we did give them a pill, and oh, by the way, when we did bomb that thing, they probably got some nerve gas, and oh, by the way, we may be responsible for the injuries of thousands of Americans.
What Charlie Rangel is doing and Joe Madison here are taking allegations, very flimsy allegations. If anybody sits down and look at the analysis we've done, and the Washington Post himself, which is not a CIA defender, tore this thing apart on evidentiary grounds. Blandon, Ricky.
Wait.
Ricky was already in the dope business before he got hurt. While Blandon was still in Nicaragua.
How do you explain Blandon's testimony under oath as a government witness that he was selling cocaine for the Contras and that the CIA was in charge of it? How do you explain that?
That's not in his testimony. That's unfortunate.
It's in the grand jury transcript.
I shared one of the...
It's posted on the internet so anybody in the world can read it.
I wish they would. This is what got me was what the police said.
Hold on, just a second.
I chaired one of these investigative committees when I was chairman of the Select Narcotic Committee on Crime. Another, Bill Hughes, the chairman of the Crime Committee in the House Judiciary, was chaired by Bill Hughes of New Jersey, and the other was Senator Kerry. Now let us all agree on one thing. Let's get to the point where there is no challenge. One, that the CIA hired people to commit illegal acts, to wit, smuggling guns illegally to Nicaragua. That goes unchallenged, right? All right. And the second thing is that these same people were involved in narcotic trafficking.
Some of the same people who were kicked off the payroll and were discovered.
Listen, now we're getting closer to agreement. Some of the people that were legally taking guns over there were involved in narcotics. That's agreed to. Let's say something else. Colonel North knew that some of these people were involved in drug smuggling.
And may have made
Would you
money.
say that?
And may have made money.
Let me make another.
Once you start agreeing to all of these things, then comes the question where we were stonewalled. They said, prove that the CIA knew it.
Wait. I've got to make another point that keeps getting mistaken here. You see, the committees did not investigate whether the CIA condoned drug trafficking. They did not investigate that. So that's what we need to get clear.
And let me take a break. I'll let you, as soon as we come back, I'll put you right in. But the other point they're making is back 2.5 years ago, I did a show about the Persian Gulf War Syndrome. And everybody said, Montel, you're out to lunch. You're crazy. Why are you telling people in America that we have to be worried about some disease? These sailors are all stupid. They're all crazy. All the Army guys are crazy. It's all made up. Now, 2 weeks ago, Congress investigates and all of a sudden, we did some stuff wrong. And now we lost our pants. So we'll find out about this. We'll take a break. When we come back, we meet an attorney who says the CIA needs new guidelines. That's what this is all about. We'll be back right after this. Yes, ma'am, you had a comment.
Yeah, I just more or less had a comment more so than a question. This is something that we've been talking about for a long time. What is the surprise now? The black race has always said we don't have the money nor the means. And it's always been, I've heard this since I was a child. And now all of a sudden it's a big surprise. Right. It's always been, we've always felt that way.
It's not a surprise. You know, we don't grow cocaine in the ghettos of America. It's got to come from somewhere. And the only thing that I will ask is that my good friend Charlie Rangel here, if he will go back and help get legislation started that will create a Records Act. Once we create a Records Act, then we can all see what's there, classified or otherwise, and make up our own minds, black or white.
Okay, Michael, I got to let you go ahead.
I was hired by the government as a tactician. Right now, what we're succumbing to is what Central Intelligence wants. We're making it a black issue.
And it's not.
And it's not. My brother died. My son died. There's millions of Americans who suffered. The important thing that we've got to remember is that it is not a black issue, and the proof that they're waiting for it to go away is that both presidential candidates are not saying a word.
And I can tell you, Montel, that my audience is much like your audience. It's across the board. I mean, I read in this Accuracy in Media where they claim that this is a Get Whitey campaign. Well, let me tell you something. There are black, white, Hispanic dealers, black, white, Hispanic distributors, black, white, Hispanic users, and the CIA, I assume, is not all white. So, you know, this is an American tragedy. It's not a get white tragedy. It's to get who's responsible and hold them accountable.
Okay, hold on just a second, Michael. Please welcome our next guest to the show. He served as a special counsel to the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations in 1989. Please welcome Mr. Jack Blum to the show. Jack, near the end of the segment, I'm going to let you in as soon as we come back. What do you think about all this? Real quick, and I'll get you some more from you when I come back from break.
We've been there and we've done that. We did this investigation. We did it 10 years ago. We had witnesses under oath. We can say for a fact that Contras dealt cocaine, that the secret war in Nicaragua created conditions that opened the door to a flood of cocaine in America. And we know that the CIA and Oliver North and people in the White House knew about that.
Can we also
we said
say,
it in the public report.
I'm getting DEA agents, I'm telling you. I got a call last week from an agent who said, Montel, I will give you the location of the airfields they flew into. One of them is in Texas at a U.S. Army Air Force, or U.S. Air Force base. So why can't we go after these guys? Because that means that it wasn't just Reagan and Ali. But it may have been Bush and
You've got to bring them in under oath. And just know about it. They actively destroyed cases. They actively put DEA agents' lives on the line to protect the drug flow. I was one of those.
Let me take a break, and I'm going to let everybody come in one at a time, and we'll try to get through the next one. We'll be back right after this.
We have been engaged in a holy war against communism for 50 years. This didn't start in Central America with this problem, and it didn't end there. We started with Kun Sa in Burma, helping the Kuomintang against the Communist Chinese. He became a major heroin dealer. In the Vietnam War, we worked with hill tribesmen who were in the heroin business. You may have seen the movie Air America. The problem here is it's gone on again and again and again. We've just recently worked with people in Afghanistan who were great heroes against the Russians and against communism, but we trained people who came back and planted a bomb at the World Trade Center and are dealing heroin. As we speak, Afghanistan and Pakistan are one of the world's great heroin centers. It ain't new.
Michael, jump in.
1993, the Cold War is over. Central Intelligence is caught red-handed smuggling a ton of cocaine from Venezuela, that bastion of communism, to the United States, red-handed. The head of DEA on 60 Minutes said there's no other way to describe it. Drug smuggling, felony drug smuggling. I went to California and spoke to the DEA agent directly involved, who told me that Central Intelligence came to her in Venezuela with what she described as a wacky, suspicious idea to smuggle a ton of cocaine, and she told them, don't do it. They did it anyway and were caught by customs. Specific people.
And they
no Cold War, no investigation.
Let me ask Jack, what happened when you did this report, which I've read, which was extensive? How did the press react when you put that out?
We were assaulted on all sides by the administration. Every time we had a day of hearings, every time we had a witness, the Reagan people came down on us like a ton of bricks. They said the witnesses were lying, they were drug dealers who were trying to get off, that we were in it for politics. And in a way, it's a wonderful thing to have this resurface in a context where we don't have the official establishment raining on it, so maybe now somebody will go back and read what we did.
But I think Mike is right. What will happen tomorrow is, since I'm the only show that's doing this, it'll be put off as being a black person feeding into the conspiracy. And I have one more point. The bottom line of this whole thing is Blandon, the gentleman that we are all talking about, who was just paid $166,000 by the CIA and DEA, it was a DEA, is in Nicaragua hanging out at a ranch. And we all, for 9 years, tried to track this guy down for being one of the biggest cocaine dealers. He's at a ranch in Nicaragua, free man, walking free, and Ricky Ross is sitting in jail, and Blandon was his supplier. How does that happen in America? Tell me. Let me take a break. We'll be back right after this. We're almost out of time. Joe, you wanted to ask Mike a question.
Mike, I know one or two congressmen. Let's do this. I'd love to take you down to Washington, let you get under oath, and sit at a table and swear to this, what you're saying today. Would you do this under oath?
I want to tell you something. Don't have any faith in Congress. Senator Frank Church is a waste of time. A friend of mine who was flying drugs in, his name is, he asked me, he says, I'm invited down to testify to the Senate. What do you advise? He says he actually flew the
You don't trust Congressman Rangel here?
No, I don't trust well, I don't believe the Congress of the United States has been able to control the Central Intelligence for 20 years. They've been working as apologists for them. In a deep cover probe, it was a New York Times bestseller where I detailed, backed up by
Mike. You know, all this, let me agree with Mike.
My
the
testimony
one
is
thing
in
that's
print.
coming out of this is that there should be outrage in these United States that any federal agency can plan to murder American citizens, whether they're black or white. The delay has been that they said that they targeted it for black communities. What we're saying is that let the CIA get on the line, let's open the records, let the president, let Dole and everyone see what's going on.
Well, let's get him down to Congress. You have
We don't want to hear it. I can fix this for you right now. If you're at home, you're watching this television show, I'd like you to get on your phone. Get on your phone this minute, call your local congressman, and you tell your congressman that Montel asked you to call, and we want hearings within a week. And you can call us so I can track how many people called. We'll get called 100 times.
I trust
very serious problem.
I trust the American people.
Exactly.
I trust Montel Williams, and God bless you and Gary Webb for doing this show, because you've done something the New York Times won't do. The Washington Post does a little job to try to make black people look like they're paranoid.
And also
the reality is, the more informed we are, the freer we are. And that's the most important.
I got to take another break. I'm going to give both of you a shot. We come back, we'll be back right after this. You know, we're almost out of time, so I would advise you to go out and read Triangle of Death by Mr. Michael Levine. Go and get it today if you want to know more information about what goes on deep inside the CIA. Let's stop hoodwinking the public. Let's just get the truth out there. Mr. Blum, you wanted to make a final comment.
Look, we've had all the investigations we need. We know what happened. The time has come to debate serious reform. There was a debate over intelligence reform. It wound up with an addition of people and an addition of money. The time has come to take a look at what we're doing. The Cold War is over. Let's find some new solutions, maybe even a whole new agency. We don't have to dig through this anymore. We know what happened.
The only reason why I would advise us to dig through it is to make sure we find out who was culpable, Senator Rango.
The CIA should be proud to open up their records and let it all hang out. The President of the United States should be in a position to say, not on my watch do Americans break the law and sell poison to kill other Americans. And if nothing else, this show is doing that.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for being here and making America aware. Join us on the next Montel One show.
Can you stay for a few minutes? Sure. Gary Webb is on the line from San Jose, and if you want to stay and talk about this article, I need some help here. Right. Gary Webb, are you there this morning?
Yeah, I am.
Good morning.
Good morning to you.
How are you?
Very tired. Early out here.
I apologize. You're really nice to do this. We've had so many calls about this, is why we asked you to do it.
Well, I'm happy to talk about it.
I actually heard you on a radio station when I was in Detroit a couple weeks ago for about an hour talking about this. This is what it's all about. It's the San Jose Mercury News, and here's a front page piece in August the 18th, and it's the first of a three-part series. Tell us, you know, in a couple minutes, what this is about.
It's about a drug ring that operated in San Francisco and Los Angeles in the mid '80s, and it was connected to a Nicaraguan anti-communist army called the FDN, which was one of the biggest groups that we know as the Contras. And it was selling cocaine in Los Angeles for the most part, but in other areas of the country as well, to the gangs, to the Crips and Bloods down in South Central Los Angeles. And they were taking the money and using some of it, I don't know how much, and we haven't figured that out yet, to buy weapons for the Contras. And you know, I know it sounds crazy. I know it sounds like the wildest conspiracy theories, which is why all our supporting documentation for the thing is posted on the internet. And if anybody's interested, I can give you the internet address a little later on.
Yeah, we've got from the Mercury News here a big chart that you put together from the Sunday story. Did you write all this, by the way?
Yes, I did.
This is a chart that shows how the money left down around Colombia. And can you give us a little bit of this scenario on how these plans?
I'm not looking at a television right now, but is that the pipeline chart?
It is.
Yeah. Those were the various smuggling routes that the ring used, starting in the late 70s up to the early 90s, to get the cocaine into the country and to get some of the money back out of the country. And it depending on the year and depending on the how intense the police scrutiny was, which wasn't very for the most part. Those are the different routes they used. They used freighters. They used stolen cars. They would just fly the stuff in suitcases early on when you didn't bring very much in.
Let me read you the first one up here, which is right near Los Angeles. It says, mid-1970s, luxury cars stolen in California were driven to Nicaragua, where they were officially imported by the Nicaraguan military to avoid stiff excise taxes and sold to wealthy Managuans.
Right.
The second number, which is way down here in Peru, it says mid-late 1970s, Peruvian cocaine was smuggled to Panama, secreted in suitcases and shoes with false bottoms and carried into the U.S. by airline passengers. Points of entry included San Francisco, Los Angeles, Houston, and New Orleans. The third one is late 1970s to 83. Cocaine from the new Cali cartel in Colombia was loaded onto freighters owned by the Gran Colombian Line. The freighters were offloaded in the ports of Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle. 4. Early 1980s, cocaine was flown from Colombia to the Bahamas, where it was loaded aboard small planes and flown into Miami. From there, couriers would take it to California aboard commercial airliners.
Right.
Now, I can go on about this, but where did you get the new information?
You know, it's been public record for 20 years almost. Well, it was just from court files. I mean, eventually, once in a while, they would catch one of these people. The DEA would file an affidavit and lay out what they knew about the drug ring's operations, and it came from, a lot of stuff in National Archives mostly, a lot of these old court cases. And then there were cases in Nicaragua which laid out the smuggling routes through that country into the United States, so we had the back end of it as well.
Gary Webb, Jack Nelson is at the table. I do want to tell the audience something, because right over your head, you can't see that. Look up on that screen there when we have it. It looks like there's a crack in the window, but that's actually condensation on our window back here because it's so muggy, and it comes right down Jack's head, so I wanted to let
you wouldn't believe how muggy it can get here in Washington.
Oh, yes, I can. Yes, I can.
Jack Nelson asked a question.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask you, because I haven't read the series. It looks fantastic, but what about the CIA involvement in all of this? Is that...
Well, that part of the story deals with the FDN, that guerrilla army that I mentioned earlier.
Right.
That was, you know, as the Iran-Contra hearings documented pretty well, that was a creation of the CIA.
Right.
And we tracked the cocaine dealers who were running this operation all the way up the ladder to the couple of CIA agents that were actually running the FDN, Enrique Bermudez and Adolfo Calero. And let me tell you, as a bit of background, most of this information, or much of the information, came out at a trial in San Diego in March. One of the cocaine brokers, a guy named Danilo Blandon, who was the head of the Southern California operation, has been working for the U.S. government for the last couple of years. And he was the star witness in a cocaine trafficking trial for the DEA in San Diego, and a lot of this stuff came out under cross-examination when he was up on the witness stand, because you know, the defense was curious, to say the least, about his relationship with the Contras and the Crips, and unfortunately they couldn't really get into a lot of it, because before the trial the United States filed a motion asking that nobody be allowed to ask Mr. Blandon about his relationship with the CIA, and it was one of the most curious documents I'd ever seen. It said, if true, this matter would be classified, and if false, it shouldn't be allowed at the trial. So,
did you get
really got a chance to quiz him in very detail about his relationship there.
Did you get any help at all out of the CIA?
During the investigation? Absolutely not. They wouldn't even return my phone calls. I mean, I filed a Freedom of Information Act request for information on Blandon and his boss, Norman Meneses, and I was told that they can't tell me anything because it's a matter of national security.
Gary Webb, where are you from originally?
My dad was in the Marines, so I'm from everywhere.
And how long have you been with the San Jose Mercury News?
I've been with the Mercury 8 years. I was with the Cleveland Plain Dealer 5 years before that.
Where'd you go to college?
I went to college in Indiana for a year, and then I went to college in Kentucky.
We're at Indiana University?
Yeah, IU in Indianapolis at community college, and I had a scholarship there, and then my dad got transferred, and I ended up at Northern Kentucky University.
We're going to take a call in a moment, but in your stories also you say that the Crips and the Bloods, the gang and the gangs in L.A. get involved in this. How?
That's the back end of the deal. That's who was buying the cocaine, and they were buying cocaine and they were buying weapons from these fellows.
How much? Can you give us some sense of how big this thing is?
Well, you know, one of the guys that talked to me was the guy who was buying it, a fellow named Freeway Rick Ross. He was the biggest crack wholesaler in Los Angeles during the 1980s. And he says, well, he and Danilo Blandon have both said that, you know, at their peak they were doing 100 kilos a week. And that's just with one dealer. You know, I don't know how much Blandon was selling to other people, but with Rick Ross, he was selling at least 100 kilos a week by 1984, 1985.
Let's take a call, and Jack Nelson's here at the desk with us, and we'll ask both of you gentlemen to get involved. Wilmington, Delaware, go ahead, please.
Good morning. I'm a little nervous because this is my first time.
That's all right.
Join the club.
But if you will remember, during the CIA Contra hearings, when Ollie North and President Reagan and all those other people were having this war in Nicaragua, this information came out then, but it was just, you know, put under the rug. But it was a well-known fact at the time that the CIA was using gangs in California and various parts of the country, black groups, and they would bring drugs into the United States, and they are part of the reason why the drug situation is the way it is today, because they infiltrated the country with all these drugs so that they could get the money, because Congress would not appropriate money for us to carry on that war in Nicaragua. So they had to get money from someplace to finance the war.
But what about right now, though? What do you think the situation is? I ask all of you, what's the status of this kind of drug running today? Gary
Well,
Webb?
I don't know what the situation is now, but the CIA is one of the reasons why the situation is what it is today.
All right, thanks, caller. Mr. Webb, what do you say about today?
Whether this liaison exists today?
Right.
I don't know. I mean, I found these guys were buying and selling from the same sources up until 1992 when Blandon was finally arrested by the DEA. So, I mean, it was going on at least until 92.
What do you think?
My guess is not. I mean, I can't believe, for example, that Judge William Webster, who I've known for a long time, who was CIA director, would not have tried to put a stop to anything like that when he was CIA director, and that Mr. Deutsch, the current CIA director, I can't believe that he would put up with something like that.
No, I'm not saying that the CIA is necessarily involved in.
No, I know you're not. I know you're not saying that. Yeah, but I'm just saying I don't think so. That was an answer to Brian's question. I know you didn't say that, Gary.
Well, in some later items here on your pipeline chart, it says in the late 1980s, Colombian cocaine was flown aboard private planes into small airfields in northern Costa Rica and southern Nicaragua. Super DC-3s leaving from San Jose, Costa Rica, loaded with general merchandise, would touch down briefly, take on a cocaine load, and continue on to U.S. airports.
Right. That came out of the trial down in Nicaragua. Norwin Meneses, the guy who was running this drug ring.
Thanks. Springfield, Missouri, you're next.
Yeah, Brian, I'm really disappointed in you. I really am. The whole theme of this is that the CIA was bringing or was supplying the Contras with guns and financing it off of drugs. That's the theme, and the only source we have for this is some questionable character. This is like the Gary Sick thing all over. And
let me. Have you read the series?
No, I have not.
Well, that's not the only source. That's the only source we've talked about.
That's the only source you've talked about.
Right. We had like 7 or 8 independent sources on this stuff, and contemporaneous.
Yeah, but you haven't provided any names.
Pardon?
No names.
Well, where do you want me to start?
Well, start.
You've got Sergeant Tom Gordon, who filed an affidavit in Los Angeles in 1986.
Was I correct on the theme of this whole thing that the CIA was supplying the Contras with guns and financing the whole thing off of drugs?
No, that's not correct.
Well,
they were certainly supplying with guns. They weren't financing the whole thing off of drugs. They were financing part of it off of drugs.
Part of it. Well, part's even bad, but.
Well, I tend to agree.
But I don't know. I'm disappointed in Brian. He puts experts on for scandals he hadn't put any experts that know about scandals for Clinton. But yet he puts on these stupid 80s scandals. Still, I mean, he's back in the past.
Caller, hold on just a second.
Well, I tell you, I don't
Gary
think
Webb,
that community in Los Angeles thinks it's a stupid scandal.
Let me just tell the caller why this gentleman's on here. It's because caller after caller kept calling up and referring to this whole subject. It seems the first thing you do is you go to the source and ask what it's all about. And then we can continue talking about this. I don't blame you for being upset. We can't deal with this thing in 15 minutes. That's
the White House to put this you back.
Oh, now there's one of your calls.
Democrat Republican.
Caller, there's not even this. We haven't talked to the White House forever in this whole thing.
Well, who did you bowed to somebody's pressure?
We didn't bow to anybody's pressure.
Let the calls come as they come.
We did. Oh, he's upset about the calls.
No, the Democrat Republican. Why don't you just let the calls? You say that the callers.
This guy's got a political agenda.
I don't care if he's got a political agenda, but he's upset because we split the call lines. Gary Webb, you want to talk some more about your sources on this thing? And who will not talk? Who just absolutely won't talk?
We filed Freedom of Information Act requests with the CIA, and as I said, those were denied on national security grounds. We filed them with the DEA, and for the first time in my life, I think, the DEA came out and said, no, we don't want to give you any records because we're concerned about invading the privacy of these drug dealers, so we don't want to tell you about them. So they didn't give us anything. The FBI sent me a letter saying it might be 2 years before they get around to answering my request. The INS has never responded. The State Department has gotten the stuff and never responded. I mean, these have been filed for like 6-8 months. And then we tried asking the DEA questions, and we couldn't get any answer from them. The only thing the CIA says is it's ludicrous, which, I'll be the first to agree. The idea of them selling drugs to the Contras, for the Contras, the Crips, is ludicrous. But everything we saw said it was true.
Let's grab a call from Dayton, Ohio. Go ahead, please.
Hi. The one question that no one's asked yet, and I'm going to ask it and see if this guy gives us an honest answer. Were these drugs targeted to black people?
I don't think they were targeted like in the manner that you mean. They were targeted insofar as, Danilo Blandón, the man who was sent to Los Angeles to sell these drugs, he had a master's degree in marketing. That was his job before the revolution. He was in charge of setting up wholesale markets for Nicaraguan agricultural produce. He came to the United States and testified. And again, he isn't the only one that says this, but he said this under oath while a government witness. He wasn't trying to beat a rap. He wasn't trying to reduce a sentence. He's a free man. And he came into court and testified to this under oath. And what he said was that he was schooled in San Francisco in this drug trade. It took him 2 days to teach him how to become a cocaine dealer. He went down to Los Angeles and didn't know what to do. And when you talk to his friends and you look at the documents that exist, what happened apparently was, the guy's a marketing expert. He looked around, he saw where it wasn't being sold, and went to sell it there. I mean, I think it was as simple as that, and I don't think anybody really cared particularly where he got the money as long as he got it.
We're going to get time for at least one more call, but I want to ask you, because the caller who was upset about this being set up by the White House, let me bring in the Mena, Arkansas story that the Wall Street Journal spent a lot of time on.
Well, we wrote about that the other day.
How does that fit in with all this? I mean,
Mena was part of a parallel operation that was going on the East Coast, which is why if people think they've heard about this before, it's because they heard about the East Coast pipeline when it was uncovered back in '85 and '86.
But I want to make the connection with the current president. He was supposedly involved as a governor?
Well, he was governor while this was going on. Whether or not he knew about it is something I don't think has been proven yet.
Let me ask Jack Nelson about this. Do you pay attention to that Mena, Arkansas story?
Well, we've written what was there, but I mean, there's no indication that Clinton as governor had anything to do with it. I mean, it's been written about with all sorts of speculation by a lot of right-wing publications, but I've never seen anything that indicated any complicity on the part of the president.
Gary Webb, if people want to get a copy of this, I understand that you have reprints for a small fee.
I think actually they decided to make it free, but you can call 408-920-5999, or you can download the whole thing from the internet with all our documentation, with sound clips so you can hear Danilo Blandón testifying to this in his own words. And you can get that at www.sjmercury.com/drugs. That's the best version, actually.
All right, let's do that one again so that people can write it down.
www.sjmercury.com/drugs.
And if, again, that telephone number, if you want to, and I assume there's no one there now.
Well, there might be a machine there now. You can leave a name and number.
408-920-5999. Are you alleging in any of this that the Republicans had anything to do with this as a party?
No, I mean, I tried to stay as far out of partisan politics on this story as I could, just tell a story about a drug operation. We mentioned obviously that Reagan was in power when he authorized this secret war down there. But Clinton's in power now, and those are the folks who put Danilo Blandón on the federal payroll. I mean, the guy that brought crack to L.A. is now a federal government employee.
All right, Virginia Beach, Virginia, go ahead, please.
Yes, concerning the Arkansas involvement in the drug thing. Ever since 1986, Bill Clinton, as governor, did not ride herd on this thing. But all the drugs came through Mena, Arkansas. Everybody knows that and reads it in the papers. Barry Seal was doing it. Barry Seal was killed. Clinton didn't really have anything to do with it except he knew about it, gave auspice to it, rode herd on it, and his government bond program received 10% of the profits, plus all the money was able to be laundered through Arkansas banks.
All right, thanks. Mr. Webb.
That's a lot of the allegations around Mena, and a lot of what she said is true. That Barry Seal was, I mean, he was one of the biggest drug dealers in the country at the time, and that's where he was based out of.
Mr. Nelson, Freedom of Information Act, has it made any difference?
Yes, in some cases it has. I mean, we've been able to get files from the FBI in some cases. I did, for the book, I got a lot of my information that I did on Terror in the Night, Klan's campaign against the Jews.
What about that, Mr. Webb? Do you...
The one we had that worked, which, I mean, sort of cemented the story for us, was the Freedom of Information Act that we filed with the National Archives. And those folks over there released some FBI documents that had been classified for about 10 years regarding this drug ring and regarding this operation, and we got them out of the files of Iran-Contra Special Prosecutor Lawrence Walsh. I mean, these are some of the FBI reports that were done either prior to the Walsh investigation as part of something else or as part of the Walsh investigation.
Let's go to Newport, Rhode Island next. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Mr. Webb, this is a very interesting conversation. You should also check at the National Archives the recently released documents on the Board of Economic Warfare from World War II, which was founded by William Casey, who worked, who was a part of the old OSS.
Yeah.
And they began by purchasing the first crop of opium that they purchased. The entire crop from Turkey was 1943. Lucky Luciano was deported to Naples after he helped with the invasion of Sicily. Luciano began his heroin trafficking from Turkey through Naples, Sicily, and Cuba.
This is all in those files?
Yeah, no, the preemptive buys, what the Board of Economic Warfare was about. The reason why I'm interested in it is some characters in your part of the country were on the Board of Economic Warfare at that, okay? And right. So, and anyway, so it's been going on for a long, long time. And then of course it's a logical thing that Casey would be involved in this type of operation in the 1980s.
Thanks, Mr.
Well, it sounds like Gary's got himself another story there.
I got.
Or if somebody doesn't, I was going to say if somebody doesn't beat you to it, Gary. But it did sound interesting what you said.
Now, this isn't the best way to get a story.
Right.
Well, you know, when you sit and listen to everybody on this thing, you start to hear all the conspiracy theories.
Well,
they come to you in a big way. I mean, you find people coming out of the woodwork because they follow these kind of things.
Yeah. That's sort of one of the risks of doing this kind of story. And frankly, I mean, the thing that gave us the sort of intestinal fortitude to do this, because we realize this is a very controversial story. This is like almost impossible to believe when you look at it. But we've got this tool now called the World Wide Web, where you can show people the documents you used. I mean, you can click on you can read the story, and if it says set a report, you can click on the word report and actually read the report. If we've got a quote in there and it's highlighted, you can hear and actually read the report. If we've got a quote in there and it's highlighted, you can hear what these folks said. So, make up your own minds. Don't take my word for it. Nobody knows who I am.
You know, when I was listening to that radio station, I don't even remember which radio station, and don't mention it, please, because I'm going to say something that they won't like. You were set up before you got on in a way you probably didn't even know about.
You're probably right.
And I just wondered how often. I mean, the fellow that was the host had an agenda. He talked about you in a specific way, and by the time you got on, I was listening thinking, I wonder if Mr. Webb has any idea what he's been saying before you got on the air.
No, I have none. Tell me about it.
Well, I can't hear on the air because I don't remember the name, I don't remember the station, and I don't want to say anything that would be, I can't remember.
But what he did was sandbag him, is that right?
Well, not necessarily, because he was very much in favor of what he had done. So it was just, but it was in a certain way that he set it up, and you got the distinct impression he was just overwhelmingly delighted that you had done this, and for a lot of political reasons that he was talking about. Let's take one more call for you, and then we'll let you go. Lawrenceburg, Tennessee, go ahead, please.
Good morning, Brian.
Morning.
Hey, it's a thrill to get through to you guys. I've had the TV turned down so long I probably lost track of the conversation. So your screener said turn the set down. One of the things that had caught my interest when you first brought the gentleman on about the investigation of the CIA involvement in the drug trafficking in Los Angeles was when you showed his chart, which I understand he couldn't see at the time. It showed all the different points where the drugs had entered the country, and I couldn't read the chart well enough to know if the area down there around the Gulf included Mena, Arkansas or not. This Mena, Arkansas thing has been going on. That accusation's been made now ever since Clinton came into office, especially tying him and Don Lassiter and the other gentleman that was the supposedly the head man in that part of the country. So it may all tie together,
We've talked about it, and I'll let Mr. Webb answer you. Go ahead.
Actually, to give you a bit of background, I mean, Mena just became an issue since Clinton became president, but the information has been available since the Kerry Committee did its investigation back in '87 and '88. A lot of what I know about Mena came from reading the report, reading the report of that investigation. As I said, they were on to this East Coast Contra pipeline, which they exposed pretty well. For some reason, that report just never had any resonance with the media.
What's your follow-up on all this?
you know, obviously now with things going on, Deutsch has asked for an investigation from the CIA Inspector General. That's one thing we're looking at. There is a lot of talk, especially among the Congressional Black Caucus, about doing hearings on this thing, which is another issue. And then you get the role of the DEA and the Justice Department in this thing, and Barbara Boxer and Dianne Feinstein have both asked for investigations on that. So there's a number of investigations going on in Washington that we're going to be following.
Gary Webb, 5 a.m. out there. Thanks a lot for getting up and telling us about this.
Here are the facts. On December 10, 2004, journalist Gary Webb was found dead with 2 gunshot wounds to his head in Carmichael, California. The coroner ruled the death a suicide, and Webb's ex-wife noted that he had been depressed after a falling out with his employers at the San Jose Mercury. Gary Webb was a controversial but lauded journalist. In 1996, he wrote a series of articles for the Mercury that were later made into a book called Dark Alliance. Prominent newspapers attacked this series, including the Washington Post and the New York Times. Eventually, Webb's own paper backed away from his work. Many believe that being professionally discredited drove him to suicide, and his claims were exaggerated. Yet conspiracy theorists believe Gary Webb was murdered because his story was not only true, but the beginning of an international scandal. So what did he actually write? Here's where it gets crazy. In this series, Webb alleged that Nicaraguan Contras were responsible for the Los Angeles crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s. He also claimed that the CIA knew of these operations and, at the very least, ignored them. At worst, he alleged they actually covered up the crimes. With extensively documented sources, Gary Webb built a case that argued the Contras were able to somehow get cocaine into the U.S. and get cash out much more easily than other drug-running organizations. Without having to pay the cost of transportation, the Contras were able to sell cocaine at bargain basement prices. Webb claimed that this cheap cocaine flooded the market, enabling the crack epidemic. While these allegations were severe, they were not far-fetched. In South and Central America, it's not unusual for revolutionary groups to use the drug trade as a way to raise money. Other groups such as FARC and the Shining Path have both employed similar strategies. Yet why were the Contras able to move their product with such ease? According to Gary Webb, it's because they had the support of the CIA. Webb never claimed that the CIA provided outright assistance to the Contras, but he did claim the CIA had knowledge of this drug trade for some time. Why on earth would an agency of the US government allow criminals to bring drugs into the country? To Webb, it was a matter of realpolitik. The money the Contras generated from the drug trade allowed them to wage war in Nicaragua, attempting to overthrow the leftist Sandinista government. Supporting the Contra army was so important that the CIA also prevented the Department of Justice and the DEA from prosecuting several known Contra smugglers. The Reagan administration had already established a precedent for this behavior by tolerating drug trafficking as long as the trafficking benefited the Contras. Additionally, later CIA investigations partially vindicated Webb's findings. It seemed that Gary Webb was professionally redeemed. So why do conspiracy buffs think he was murdered? According to conspiracy theorists like Alex Jones, Webb was assassinated to prevent the publication of a second book, one with even more evidence of criminal activity by the CIA. Some of Webb's acquaintances say that he told them if he was found dead, it would not be a case of suicide. The conspiracy world is rife with questions regarding this death, including debates about the ability to deliver 2 self-inflicted gunshots. This becomes a conspiracy within a conspiracy. To the mainstream, Gary Webb committed suicide because he was blackballed for speaking truth to power, and people who believe he was murdered are only prolonging the pain for Webb's surviving family and friends. Yet to conspiracy theorists, this is an open and shut case of political assassination. This is clearly a situation full of stuff they don't want you to know. But here's the real question. Does our government have secrets worth killing for?
Dies mysteriously. His friends and family don't buy the official verdict, so they launch an investigation and begin to suspect that he was killed to bury a potentially explosive secret. Bernard Goldberg has been looking into this case, and he has more on it. Bernie?
Connie, the motto of the Marine Corps is Semper Fidelis, always faithful. But today, as far as the family of Colonel James Sabo is concerned, that motto is a joke. Colonel James Sabo was the kind of Marine you'd find on a recruiting poster. A Vietnam hero, an ace jet pilot, rows of medals.
Jim Sabo was my best friend, and he was my mentor when I was on active duty in the Marine Corps. He was an individual who I trusted completely.
Bill Callahan knew Jim Sabo for 17 years.
He's the kind of the guy when things got going bad that you could depend on and turn to take care of the things that needed to be taken care of.
Then one morning, 2 years ago, they found James Sabo at home at the El Toro Marine Base in Southern California, in his bathrobe, dead.
Grant peace and mercy to Jimmy.
One bullet through his head, fired into his mouth. The military said it was suicide.
He said goodbye, Sal, like he always did. I kissed him goodbye, and I left. And then I came back and walked in the house and found him in the backyard.
Sally Sabo, his widow, had gone to church that morning, as she did almost every morning. Did he appear suicidal?
No, not at all, because he was functioning in his usual manner. Got up and took a shower, had his 2 cups of coffee, was watching television. If I thought he was in any way very depressed or suicidal, I would have never left him.
The straightforward answer at this point is your father killed himself. That's the official military conclusion. Do you believe it?
No, I personally do not.
Teacher?
No.
Mrs. Sabo?
No, I don't believe it. I still can't comprehend it. And instead of getting more realistic, it seems more impossible every day.
There was no suicide note, but more troubling than that, there was no fingerprint on the shotgun lying next to Colonel Sabo's body. If you shoot yourself, are you going to leave a fingerprint on some part of the gun?
On one part of the gun, yes, sir.
Sergeant Randy Robinson was one of the first investigators to arrive at the scene.
He had to pull the trigger with his finger. He would have had to hold the barrel with his hand. There would be fingerprints on the gun, yes.
But military investigators from the Navy and the Marines said there's a reason Colonel Sabo's fingerprints were not on the gun. The heat from the shotgun blast, they said, melted them away.
Utter BS. Utter BS. If you're not wearing gloves, you're going to leave a fingerprint on a firearm. Your hands secrete oils and salt and everything else, and there's going to be a fingerprint on that gun unless you are wearing gloves. And Colonel Sabo was not wearing gloves when I observed him.
But there was one possible motive for suicide. Colonel James Sabo, the Marine Corps straight-as-an-arrow hero, was under investigation for using a military airplane to haul personal items to his son in Washington State. Stereo speakers, posters, and a clock. The Marines wanted him to resign.
If all of the naval aviators in the Navy and the Marine Corps were put to the same standards as Colonel Sabo was, probably 92% of those would be charged with the same offense.
That's how common it is?
Very common. Very common.
Is that the kind of thing your best friend would have killed himself over?
Absolutely not.
In fact, Bill Callahan says Colonel Sabo had told him he thought the charges were so petty he would fight them at a court-martial, which is one reason so many people don't buy the suicide scenario. So in the beginning, you thought it was a suicide?
It generally turns out that way, so I didn't expect anything else.
Gene Wheaton was in the military for 30 years. Now he's been hired by the Sabo family to investigate the colonel's death. And he doesn't believe it was suicide either.
The trajectory of the shotgun blast would have almost required the colonel to be a contortionist to have fired the shotgun himself. That means he would have had to have held the shotgun at an angle of such distorted proportions that it would have been almost physically impossible for him to discharge the shotgun.
But if it wasn't suicide, there could only be one possibility: murder. And that's exactly what his friends and family believed it was: cold-blooded murder. And as far-fetched as it may sound, they believe Colonel Sabo was killed by one or more people from the United States military, not just to ensure his silence about the improper use of military airplanes, but to make sure he never talked about something far more sinister than that, about what they said was a secret connection between the United States Marines and international drug smugglers. Are you telling me that drugs were being flown into U.S. military bases?
Yes, sir.
By
covert operators who were flying weapons south into Central and South America, and they were protected on their return flights from customs inspections. If Colonel Sabo was murdered, he would have had to have known about the covert flights that were going south with the weapons and the covert flights that were coming back with the drugs and laundered drug money.
And to Gene Wheaton, this is where Colonel Sabo's decision to fight the charge of improperly using a military airplane becomes crucial.
He was going to demand a court-martial which would publicly bring out the total covert operations that were going on in the military.
So what you're saying is that somebody was afraid that if he went to court-martial, information would come out that there were drugs being brought up from Central and South America into the United States via military air bases. And in order to shut him up, somebody killed him. That's what you're saying.
I'm saying if we prove a murder case, that's exactly it.
But in order to believe that Colonel Sabo was killed because he knew about secret drug operations in the military, you have to believe what is virtually unbelievable, that there were in fact secret drug operations sanctioned by agents working for the United States government. Sound crazy? You're a pilot.
Right.
Well, that's exactly what this man, Tosh Plumlee, says happened. He's a former Army captain who says he was flying drug planes into this country as a civilian, performing covert operations for the CIA and other government agencies. And you were flying planes from?
From Central America into the San Diego area, as well as the southern Florida area, as well as New Orleans area.
Did you ever fly into a military base?
I flew into 3 separate military bases that I recall. One was Homestead Air Force Base. This was with 1,200 kilos of cocaine. The other one was Laguna, which was a drop. That's 500 kilos of cocaine.
Plumlee says he was paid up to $5,000 a flight, and he says he told all this to Senate investigators, in secret and under oath. Sources in Washington confirm this. This is the first time he's ever spoken on television. You're flying cocaine?
We're flying cocaine.
From Central America into military bases in the United States?
Large quantities of cocaine. We would sometimes get our aircraft out of Southern California, Palomar, China Lake, outside 29 Palms.
These are all military bases?
These are all military bases. Sometimes these aircraft would be civilian aircraft. Sometimes these aircraft would be military aircraft.
Plumlee says he was told the flights were part of a sting operation designed to get information on drug smugglers and then bust them.
They never went in and did one thing. That's when a lot of pilots began to turn. That's when a lot of pilots began to say, what in the hell is happening here?
And Plumlee says he came to believe that U.S. agents were using the profits from drug smuggling to buy weapons, to sell to armies south of the border, a theory shared by investigator Wheaton.
They not only supply friendly forces, they supply the enemy too. This is a business for them.
Maybe I'm naive, but this sounds crazy, right?
Well, so did Iran-Contra until it became public.
Plumlee says he never flew drugs into the El Toro Marine Base in California, where Colonel Sabo was third in command. And he says he knows nothing of Colonel Sabo's death. Does it sound believable to you that if a high-ranking Marine knew something about covert operations and somebody was afraid he might go public with it, is it plausible that somebody might try to kill him?
Well, to me, yes, it would be extremely, it would really be plausible.
What do you think happened to your brother?
I think my brother was murdered.
Cold-blooded murder.
Cold-blooded, calculated, premeditated murder.
David Sabo is a neurologist in South Dakota. James Sabo was his younger brother. Dr. Sabo, who is recovering from a broken hip, says the Sabo family has spent more than $100,000 on the investigation to find out what really happened to his brother. No, Doctor, if we believe this, I mean, we have to then believe a lot of other things that are hard to believe. That the killer, if he was killed, was probably somebody who was saluted. Probably somebody in the military.
Well, there's no question about it. There was absolutely no question. There's no question in my mind that this was ordered by the military. It was carried out by the military.
Does our government have secrets worth killing for?
Are
you aware of whether or not narcotics proceeds at some time may or may not have supported Contra efforts?
Yes, sir. Narcotics proceeds were used to shore up the Contra effort.
One of the important facets of the discussion should be what I call conspiracy theories. There are lots of folks out there, and there are books written on this by people who are in a position to know. Former DEA agents, former CIA operatives, things like that. And they tell stories about huge amounts of money, large-scale corruption in the big parts of government, etc. And are these stories true? Ask yourself this question. If you're going to have $1 million in cash, how much corruption can you buy at any level for that $1 million? And the answer has to be quite a bit.
On December 10th, 2004, investigative journalist Gary Webb was found shot in his apartment.
No. You lying.
No.
When?
Saturday.
Oh, man. Well, he used to tell me that he would come home at night and there'd be guys, you know, climbing up the pole late at night, 12 and 1 o'clock, and you know, at nighttime, and people following him around everywhere he goes. He has cars telling him, and his phone was tapped, and he was just saying that they were kind of like giving him the blues. You know, a lot of things were going on that he didn't really like, and he said it was the government too.
By the way, the head of the DEA, his name is Rob Bonner, is a friend of mine throughout the first George Bush administration, documented that yes, the CIA was involved with the importation of a fair amount of cocaine with regard to the Iran-Contra, etc. But it just has to happen because of the money.
We understand what you're saying. A ton of cocaine was smuggled into the United States of America.
Well,
in cooperation with the CIA?
That's exactly what appears to have happened.
When I was a clandestine case officer, I thought I was doing God's work, the nation's work, by recruiting traitors in varied countries around the world. And what I didn't realize was that I was literally there for show. I was just going through the motions because the traitors weren't producing really useful information. We were ignoring all of the openly available information that would have produced much richer results. Let's jump over to General Manuel Noriega in Panama. General Noriega was told by Bill Casey, then director of the Central Intelligence Agency, that he could have a free run with drugs into America, provided that he allowed us to support the Contras from Panama. That was a straight-up deal.
George Bush Sr. came to Guatemala on January 13, 1986. And he approached me and asked me what I did there at the U.S. Embassy, what my job description was. And I told him I was a DEA agent working international narcotics investigations. And I told him, look, you know, we have gathered intelligence that the Contras are involved in drug trafficking down in El Salvador. And then he just smiled, shook my hand, and walked away from me. And it was then and there that I knew that my government knew that these atrocities were occurring.
How could this be possible? And then we read through the documents, and then that's when Gary Webb started explaining it to us, and we was like, everything came together now.
One of the most paramount moments, perhaps caused by Gary Webb's Dark Alliance, took place in November of 1996.
It was a monumental historic event. I mean, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency was coming to Watts to face the people.
Now, we all know that the U.S. government and the CIA supported the Contras in their efforts to overthrow the Sandinista government in Nicaragua in the middle 80s. Now, it is alleged the CIA also helped the Contras raise money for arms by introducing crack cocaine into California.
Deutsch felt he had to do something to try to deal with the outrage that was foaming all over the country at the time. And of course, it just blew up in his face.
CIA fights drugs. CIA does not encourage drugs.
I mean, it was actually one of the most monumental blunders of all time, if you think about it.
We have no evidence of a conspiracy by the CIA to engage in encouraging drug traffickers in Nicaragua or elsewhere in Latin America.
Deutsch was there because of the Gary Webb stories. The Gary Webb stories had sparked a national furor.
I would like to have Richard Ross's brother to speak, please.
The United States government turned their head and let this cocaine come into the United States of America.
Allow Gary Webb to have full access.
This whole thing is orchestrated.
It was near pandemonium. It was about, I guess, 1,200 people in a standing room only in the auditorium, 2,000 people outside listening on loudspeakers. And it was very hard to keep control. I got called on finally, and I said to her very clearly, I was looking right at Deutsch.
I am a former Los Angeles police narcotics detective, and I work South Central Los Angeles, and I will tell you, Director Deutsch, that the agency has dealt drugs throughout this country for a long time. Director Deutsch, I will refer you to 3 specific agency operations known as Amadeus, Pegasus, and Watchtower. I have Watchtower documents heavily redacted by the agency. I was personally exposed to CIA operations and recruited by CIA personnel who attempted to recruit me in the late 70s to become involved in protecting agency drug operations in this country.
He stumbled and stammered and wrung his hands.
If you have information about CIA illegal activity in drugs, you should immediately bring that information to wherever you want, but let me suggest 3 places. The Los Angeles Police Department.
And of course my response was, I started there 18 years ago, sir, and they tried to kill me. Now what do you want me to do?
If this information turns up wrongdoing, we will bring the people to justice and make them accountable.
The crowd started chanting, "We told you, we told you, we told you." And it was a great moment of unity. And it was a healing moment for me.
When the Taliban was in Afghanistan, they were what they were. But they were definitely against opium crops cultivation. And a lot of it was destroyed.
Police don't bother them. The U.S. military has other priorities.
So within this past year that the U.S. government has control of Afghanistan, why is there a major crop of heroin that's going to be coming into the U.S. or has come into the U.S.?
This program includes dramatic reenactments of scenes which depict real events and contains material which is intended for
George Bush.
Welcome to the show.
Today, more drugs are coming into America than ever before.
We have the best intelligence of the world. We could stop anything we want to stop.
You still may know little about
The CIA's involvement with drug lords.
Happened in Vietnam. Happened in the Iran-Contra affair.
This was a multi-billion-dollar business.
Even more menacing, the CIA have gone into the drug trade and are trying to take over the government.
Hey, it's funny. In the war
on drugs,
which side is the CIA on?
When you think crack, don't think black. When you think crack, think CIA.
Crack. The CIA.
Crack.
The CIA.
Crack.
The CIA.
The CIA.
Christopher Simpson is an author and professor at American University, Washington, D.C.
The CIA's operational directorate, in other words, that's their covert operations, paramilitary, dirty tricks, call it whatever you want, has, for at least 40 years that we can document, paid for a significant amount of its work through the sales of heroin and cocaine. It happened in Vietnam. It happened in Afghanistan. It happens in South America. It happened in the Iran-Contra affair.
In 1987, Oliver North was investigated for his role in a covert drugs for arms operation. The Iran-Contra hearings proved that the CIA smuggled cocaine to fund the Nicaraguan Contra army.
The intelligence agencies of this country, by God, should be involved in this battle instead of working with the scum of the earth, which they've been doing.
Former DEA agent Celerino Castillo discovered the CIA drug smuggling operation at Ilopango Air Force Base, El Salvador.
When I started seeing all this, I started documenting and writing reports. And then I was forewarned by my supervisor that if I kept it up, I was going to kick other country and send back because I was making waves. When I approached the ambassador in El Salvador and I told him, look, the Contras here at Ilopango Airport, your airport, they're flying drugs. They sell it, my hands are tied. It's a covert operation being run by the White House. There's nothing I can do about it. And I was devastated because I was, first of all, trying to justify what they were doing. I said, there's got to be a catch to this. There's something here that's not right.
I mean, we were complicitous as a country in narcotics traffic at the same time as we're spending countless dollars in this country to try to get rid of this problem. It's mind-boggling.
See, we go back, every drug trafficker that was flying for the Contras were all documented in DEA files, and yet they were getting U.S. visas to fly to the U.S. by the Central Intelligence Agency.
Many of the planes from Ilopango were landing at Mena Air Force Base in Arkansas. Arkansas journalist Mara Leverett investigated the drug smuggling operation.
A tremendous volume of cocaine was coming into the state. People wanted to know what was happening in Mena and Arkansas, and so a good deal of information had come to light. Arkansas had been the home base for this major international drug smuggler, and he had been able to operate without being stopped.
In January 1986, Barry Seal was subpoenaed by the Arkansas grand jury investigation of the Mena connection. He became a government informant.
My top load paid me $1.5 million for a single trip.
Because of the CIA connections and the federal involvement in that operation, no investigation of Barry Seal or anyone connected with him was ever going to be allowed to go anywhere, because if any part of that operation were brought to light, it might tumble the whole house of cards.
Before he could testify about his role in the CIA drug operation, Barry Seal was gunned down in cold blood.
Here's, by any definition, the biggest major drug kingpin we've ever run into, and nobody seems to know a thing about it, and nobody wants to raise it.
I don't know if we've got the worst intelligence system in the world. I don't know if we've got the best and they knew it all and just overlooked it. But no matter how you look at it, something's wrong. Something is really wrong out there.
Former cop Mike Rupert was forced out of the LAPD for investigating police ties to CIA drug trafficking.
I am a former LAPD narcotics detective. I worked South Central, and I saw the hands-on working relationship, the interface between local police departments and the CIA. What we saw was a deliberate effort by the agency to make sure that large quantities of the cocaine, the high-quality cocaine, got into the inner cities, like Los Angeles.
After a report in the San Jose Mercury News, CIA Director John Deutsch was forced to confront allegations of drug dealing.
I had confronted CIA Director John Deutsch at Locke High School. He had come to Los Angeles to talk about allegations of CIA dealing drugs.
Deutsch knew exactly what was going on. What he didn't realize was the fact that that many people were going to show up.
Sir, the man in the leather jacket.
I will tell you, Director Deutsch, as a former Los Angeles police narcotics detective, that the agency has dealt drugs throughout this country for a long time. The room exploded. What I saw at that time was that there was a crying lack of knowledge in the body politic about how much evidence there really was about the criminal activities of the Central Intelligence Agency, specifically dealing drugs. Director Deutsch, I will refer you to 3 specific agency operations known as Amadeus, Pegasus, and Watchtower. I have Watchtower documents heavily redacted by the agency. I was personally exposed to CIA operations and recruited by CIA personnel who attempted to recruit me in the late 70s to become involved in protecting agency drug operations in this country. I have been trying to get this out for 18 years, and I have the evidence. If you have information about CIA illegal activity in drugs, you should immediately bring that information to wherever you want, but let me suggest 3 places. The Los Angeles Police Department, It is your choice, the Los Angeles Police Department, the Inspector General, or office of one of your Congress persons from this. 18 years ago, sir, and I got shot at for it.
What was the big deal? He came up here, he sat there, and he lied to the American people.
Let me say something else. If this information turns up wrongdoing, we will bring the people to justice and make them accountable.
He came, he went, and nothing ever happened. First of all, there is no such thing as the war on drugs. There never has been and never will be.
What's happening here in America is that our government is inadvertently supplying the hard drugs. Then they're putting the people who use them in this country in jail.
But there was more disturbing news in the fall of 1993 when a report revealed that the government itself may have been running drugs. The head of the DEA at the time, Robert Bonner, said that a ton of pure cocaine worth hundreds of millions of dollars had been smuggled into the United States. And he blamed the CIA, saying the agency had joined the Venezuelan National Guard in drug smuggling.
Let me understand what you're saying. A ton of cocaine was smuggled into the United States of America by the Venezuelan National Guard?
Well,
in cooperation with the CIA?
That's exactly what appears to have happened.